She was a hard-working nurse at a busy city hospital.
She went into nursing because she wanted to help others.
She was thoughtful of everybody.
This is the type of person, young person you want in your community.
But now she's the victim of a shocking crime.
We have a possible kidnapping.
He pulled out a gun and pushed her into the car.
She's screaming and hollering.
The suspect drove away in her vehicle.
Had her desire to help put her in danger.
The hospital has a mental crisis center.
He was not in his right mind.
She was like, girl, he a psychopath. It's ridiculous.
He actually stalked her.
Or did she have a deadly secret?
She tried to hide it from her family.
I only knew what she told me.
I just don't know why she lied.
I don't see how that could be.
Everybody has a little toxic in them.
Wait, she stabbed you?
May 13th, 2023. It's Mother's Day weekend in Detroit, Michigan, America's Motor City.
Detroit is a very unique town.
There's just a great energy that's going on in the city of Detroit. It's just a wonderful place to be.
And at 7:30 this Saturday morning, it's shift change at one of the city's largest hospitals when nurse Colleen Michaels spots her coworker Patrice Wilson heading toward her car.
She left work at her normal time, the normal doors that she exited.
She was walking out after her shift, going to her car, and that's when things went horribly wrong.
As Patrice heads to her SUV, her coworker notices someone approaching.
It's pretty commonplace to see people hanging around out there. The hospital also has a mental crisis center, and people are released from those doors at all hours of the day.
Visitors are constantly coming and going, checking on their sick family and friends.
But as Patrice gets to her car, the person runs up to the driver's side door and forces Patrice inside.
What in the world?
It looks like they're struggling inside the vehicle.
It's very clear there was some type of physical altercation going on.
Then, as she looks on in horror, Patrice's coworker hears an unmistakable sound.
Oh my God!
The suspect at that point drove away in her vehicle.
And Patrice is still inside the car.
Security! We need some help over here!
Patrice Wilson's early life had been touched by tragedy more than once.
When Patrice was 9 years old, her older brother was hit by a car while riding his bicycle, and he ended up dying from his injuries.
She spent a lot of time with her brother. He took her everywhere he went. Those two right there were really close.
Not long after that, she also lost her father.
I asked her a lot of times, you want me to get you some counseling? She used to be like, oh, no, Ma, I'm okay.
Instead, Patrice chose to lose herself in her schoolwork.
I think that's how she dealt with her grief, from her dad and her brother diving into her books.
I never had to tell her to do her homework. She always took a nap when she came home first, and then she was like, I'm gonna get up and go do my homework.
She excelled all through high school.
No matter who she met, she always left a good impression. From middle school on, she was always such a good vibe and never had any issues with anybody.
Everyone just talked about how much of a loving, caring person she was.
And she decided to make caring a career.
After she graduated from high school, she went on to Oakland University College.
She excelled in science. And I'm like, you can do it. You have that in you.
She went on to work as hard as possible to be a nurse because she said, if I can help anybody else, that's what I'm going to do.
In college, Patrice met the man who would be the father of her child.
Patrice got pregnant in her last year of college, and as a parent, I was kind of upset about it because I didn't want that life for her. I wanted her to experience life and then have children.
She wasn't looking to be a mother. However, once it happened, she said, I have to do what I have to do to be the best mother I can be.
Patrice was committed to raising her child, but she wasn't gonna let that keep her from becoming a nurse.
She kept studying, even in the hospital with the baby on the way.
I saw those books and I was thinking to myself, she was not playing, she was serious.
As soon as she pushed that baby out, the final was due.
She actually took her final exam from her hospital bed after she had gave birth.
Once she got her nursing degree, Patrice had everything she'd been wanting. Almost.
Patrice's relationship with her son's father, unfortunately, they didn't work out.
They decided to go their separate ways.
Patrice devoted herself to raising her son.
As a mother, she was the one to do it all. There wasn't anything that was out of her reach when it came to her son.
Her and her son had a bond that was unbreakable.
And her career as a nurse was taking off.
Patrice was a nurse on one of the busiest shifts, a night shift, where everything happens, and at a hospital that is arguably one of the busiest, if not the busiest, in our city.
Patrice did many different roles. She worked in the ICU, she did med-surg, she was a correctional nurse.
But there was still something lacking in her life.
Patrice had made a life for herself, but she really wanted someone to share that life with.
She was looking for love.
She needed to feel like love from a man wholeheartedly.
And she found it with 36-year-old Jameer Miller.
Patrice and him met through mutual friend. Patrice likes to dance. And her friend posted her on her Instagram. And he slid in the friend DM and said, "Hey, who is that?"
Then, tipped off by her friend, Jameer reached out to Patrice.
And it grew into a full-blown relationship.
They would just have a good time together.
I'll see you tomorrow.
But now, the day before Mother's Day, something has gone horribly wrong.
What in the world? A coworker just witnessed a man force his way into Patrice's car and drive away.
That was just crazy, and it's unbelievable.
Worse, the coworker heard what she believed to be gunshots.
Colleen rushes to alert hospital security, but it's too late.
Patrice, her car, and the suspect have all vanished.
Detroit 911, what is your alert? We have a possible kidnapping.
29-year-old single mother Patrice Wilson had turned her heartache into hope.
Patrice had lost her father and brother when she was a child. The double tragedy had inspired her to become a nurse.
She was a good nurse. She was compassionate. She loved what she did.
And she had recently found new love with 36-year-old Jameer Miller.
Everything was going right for her.
But now, after a brazen abduction outside the hospital where she works, Patrice's future hangs in the balance.
One of Patrice's coworkers had seen a strange person in the parking lot. They forced their way into the car and after hearing gunshots, drove off with her.
Patrice's coworker alerted hospital security, who contacted the police.
We have a possible kidnapping.
Everyone was in shock. How did something like this happen outside a hospital?
When investigators arrive on the scene, they question the coworker who witnessed the abduction.
We were able to determine that the suspect was in a disguise.
He looked kind of strange, going around with a blonde wig on and an orange hat and sunglasses.
Did that seem unusual to you?
To be honest, not really.
You know, they were in a hospital setting.
You would think this person has some kind of mental crisis.
But according to the witness, he appeared to be waiting on Patrice.
As soon as Patrice left the hospital, that man in the blonde wig approached and pushed into the car.
Did she give you any indication that she knew the man?
No.
And they fought?
Yeah, until...
She said she heard gunshots.
But because of the disguise, she couldn't give detectives a good description of the assailant.
And there's little at the crime scene in the way of clues.
Patrice's vehicle was gone. There was no question about that. And there was a pink shoe that was left where her car was, also giving some belief that there was an abduction that happened.
The police figured the shoe came off after Patrice was pushed into her car.
However, they find no evidence of a shooting.
There were no shell casings found.
Although that could just mean that the casings remained in Patrice's SUV after the shots were fired.
Hoping for further confirmation of the eyewitness's story, the detectives ask hospital security for the surveillance camera footage from the parking garage.
We were able to pull video from the hospital in various areas, such as the parking garage and the area that overlooks where Patrice had parked her car.
Police figure, let's look at the footage to see if there's any way we can figure out what happened and get some type of leads.
When detectives scan through the footage, it matches what Patrice's coworker described.
The video surveillance that we watched showed what appeared to be a black male wearing a dark-colored tracksuit with a long blonde wig and a baseball cap. He also had a mask across his face, like a surgical mask.
He follows Patrice to her vehicle.
It's hard to see what happens inside the SUV, but once the man gets in, he never exits.
The car backed out and sped away. And that was the last time anyone seen her.
We didn't know initially what we had. We didn't know if this was a kidnapping and abduction or a kidnapping from a carjacking. So all of those things were in play.
In any case, the detective's first priority is finding Patrice.
The police issue a be on the lookout for Patrice and her vehicle.
Detectives were trying to find this SUV and trying to get any type of leads to where it could be going.
We wanted to do everything we could to find her, and I deployed a number of assets, our special response team, our commercial auto theft unit. We really deployed all of those assets to ensure we had the greatest likelihood of recovering her unharmed.
Then, while the call goes out to police across the city, Patrice's mother arrives on the scene.
Her mother works in food services at the hospital.
They just were screaming and hollering like somebody's just abducting her. So I ran out of the kitchen from the hospital up to security.
They said Patrice has been kidnapped.
Look, that's what we think happened. We're not sure.
Oh, my God.
It's okay. It's okay.
At this point, she is totally terrified, and she just hopes that Patrice is okay.
Everybody was trying to figure it out, trying to find her car.
It's okay. It's okay. Do you know anyone who would want to harm your daughter?
No, everybody loves her.
Although she says there is one person who might be angry with Patrice.
She did just break up with her boyfriend.
She had just had enough.
Are those from Jameer?
He was abusive. He was possessive.
Detectives investigating the abduction of Patrice Wilson from the parking lot outside the hospital where she worked have learned that the 29-year-old nurse recently broke up with her boyfriend, Jameer Miller.
How long ago was that?
It was a couple weeks ago.
Do you know why?
No, not exactly, but
Patrice tried to hide from her family the situation she had with Jameer.
I only knew what she told me and what she put on social media. So outside looking in, they was good. I didn't see nothing. No red flags.
But as the relationship soured, the facade fell.
As much as she tried to hide it from her family, they figured something was going on between the two.
I thought the relationship was just toxic, honestly. I mean, everybody has a little toxic in them. But he was possessive.
The going back and forth and the fussing and the arguing, that's not healthy. It's not a healthy relationship at all.
Eventually, Patrice had had enough.
She got to a point where she was pulling away.
and she was ready to get out of it and move on.
But Jameer couldn't accept that.
She was having trouble breaking it off with Miller. He wouldn't let go.
While she was trying to leave him, that's when the persistence started.
He kept calling her, kept bringing her flowers, trying to cut her grass.
And when the gifts and flowers didn't work, Jameer tried a different approach.
He would do strange things. He would steal her license plate off her car.
He'd come over there, try to take the Ring camera off.
I didn't understand. I told her, what's the purpose behind this? What's the goal?
Patrice didn't understand either, but she wasn't worried.
She like, that don't mean nothing. Like, none of this scares me.
She wrote off Jameer's actions as essentially harmless.
But it didn't go much further than that, I didn't think.
Of course you're gonna send me flowers, because we're not talking. Of course you're gonna take my license plate off because you want me to contact you to get my license plate back. Of course you're gonna drive past my job because you wanna see if I'm at work, if I'm not out with somebody else. And she was very calm. She was just like, that don't faze me, really.
Only now that Patrice has apparently been abducted outside her workplace, the detectives suspect she may have been wrong.
The first person of interest is the ex.
But detectives' first priority is finding Patrice.
And her mother may have an idea.
She was able to give us some real-time information on where Patrice could possibly be located.
Apparently, Patrice and some of her friends had an app that shared the location of each other's phones.
Great, can you access that?
I can't, but my niece can.
When I answered the phone, my aunt was like, look at Patrice's location. That crazy guy just kidnapped her from work.
What do you mean she's missing?
Patrice's cousin checks the app.
The last location that was pinged was a car wash in Garden City.
Detectives rush to the location shown on the app.
I went there myself with my partner, but there was nothing going on. Her car wasn't there.
But it's not entirely a dead end.
I went and talked to the car wash owner. I described the vehicle to him, and he says, yeah, there's a guy over there vacuuming out the SUV.
The detectives have just missed him.
We pulled video surveillance, and you could see him clear as day getting change for the vacuums. You can see him cleaning it out.
The detectives assume it's the kidnapper.
In the video, the person was not wearing the same thing as the person who abducted her. He had shorts on and a t-shirt.
He's no longer wearing the mask and wig either. But the video still doesn't give the police a clear view of the suspect's face.
But the fact that they can't identify the suspect isn't the most disappointing thing about the video.
Because detectives can only think of one reason for the suspect to be cleaning Patrice's car.
Something that happened other than just an abduction.
This was a homicide.
The search for Patrice Wilson has led detectives to a car wash in suburban Detroit.
She was abducted a few hours earlier from the parking lot of the hospital where she works.
There's no sign of Patrice, but the detectives do recover video of someone, presumably the assailant, cleaning out the interior of her stolen SUV.
At that point, the detectives determine that they are no longer investigating a kidnapping.
Until we saw the video from the car wash, we were hopeful in finding Patrice alive.
The detectives figured the suspect was trying to clean blood or other incriminating evidence out of the vehicle.
However, while hope of finding Patrice alive is fading, the detectives do have another lead on her whereabouts.
Her mom just sent us another text with location. Oh, great. Okay. Hey, can you email us this footage?
We found out that her phone was in Inkster, went out there to search for her.
Inkster is a Detroit suburb just about a mile or two from the car wash.
We went out there to search for her, knocked on the door.
Can I help you?
Ma'am, Detroit PD, do you know a Patrice Wilson?
Yeah, I know Patrice.
She indicates, hey, yeah, I know who Patrice is. She used to date my son.
It's Jameer's mom. Now we might have something here.
Is your son here?
No, he's not here.
We talked to her, try to feel her out to see how much she may or may not know, or if Jameer had even told her anything.
Have you heard anything about Patrice possibly being abducted?
Goodness, no.
She seemed genuinely surprised by the news.
But when detectives start asking questions about her son, her attitude changes.
Jameer Miller's mother was not cooperative.
When you're talking with the parent of a suspect, they are always going to be very guarded, and there's only so much you're going to get.
She would give some information, but not enough to actually help us.
When was the last time that your son saw Patrice?
I don't know. I have no way of knowing that.
There's a lot of emotional things going on in that conversation, and you can kind of read between the lines, so to speak. You could infer that she knew why we were at her home, but she wouldn't give any answers to what she knew about her son and his involvement.
Well, do you know where we can find Jameer?
No, I don't.
She doesn't want to be forthcoming with any information.
Like, she might even be covering up for her son.
Even when the detectives inform her that Patrice's phone had pinged at her house.
I don't see how that could be. I don't even remember the last time she was here.
However, she does admit that Jameer had been by the house earlier in the day.
She says he was here that morning, that he ultimately made a change of clothing from the clothes he had on into some shorts and a t-shirt.
Do you know what kind of car he's driving?
I don't know. I didn't look outside.
She seems like she's trying to hold back information.
But when the detectives ask to look around, she doesn't refuse. Inside, there's no sign of Patrice or her phone. But the detectives do find Jameer's phone.
His mother says that when Jameer came to the house that morning, he left his cell phone to charge.
The detectives take Jameer's phone and head back to the station.
Utilizing cell phone data in an investigation is very crucial because it helps you to pinpoint where you are at a particular point in time. And once we gather all of that information and we come back and sit down at the table, then we start putting the pieces together. It's like you just laid out the puzzle pieces and you start putting them together to see how everything fits.
Looking at the location data on Jameer's phone, it appears that it pinged off all the same cell towers as Patrice's phone had that morning.
Which is another indication that Jameer was most likely the man who kidnapped Patrice Wilson.
The detectives redouble their efforts to find Jameer Miller.
The police put his name out in the media and on the street, saying that they needed to talk to him.
But before they locate him, the detectives get a lead on Patrice's SUV.
Police in the Detroit suburb of Novi spot the SUV parked at an apartment complex.
When cops first saw the car there, they watched it for a few hours. They wanted to see if the suspect was going to come back to the car.
They stayed on it for a couple hours. There was no movement at all.
When no one showed up, they approached the car.
And as they get closer, they realize it isn't empty.
There was somebody in the back of the vehicle.
Patrice's remains had been located.
Investigating the attack on Patrice Wilson outside the Detroit hospital where she worked, had already suspected they were dealing with more than just a carjacking and abduction.
We knew going in that it could be a homicide. We knew that she was in great danger, and witnesses provided us information along the lines of hearing a gunshot. So when you put all those things together, unfortunately, you know that you are likely going to be dealing with an extraordinarily tragic event.
And now the police know for certain.
A patrol officer in the Detroit suburb of Novi has found a woman's body in the back of Patrice's SUV.
That's when the investigation transitioned into a homicide investigation.
The initial goal was to try to recover her unharmed, but unfortunately, that was not what occurred.
When homicide detectives arrive at the scene, they quickly determine how she died.
Patrice's body had suffered at least 3 or 4 gunshot wounds. They were all to the torso.
It looks like 2 additional shots grazed her right wrist and her thigh.
The witness at the hospital who said she heard a couple of gunshots, that tells me that she was most likely killed instantly.
And despite the video of the killer attempting to clean out Patrice's SUV at the car wash, The passenger floorboards were soaked with blood.
Based on how the vehicle looked, where the blood pooled and where the blood was, he threw her over into the passenger side and drove away.
But who was the man who abducted and killed her?
After the body was turned over to the medical examiner, crime scene techs started processing the car for clues to identify the killer.
Police know that whoever did this is a danger to the community, and they have to be taken off the streets.
While CSI processes Patrice's car, the detectives contact the family with the news that she's dead.
They came to the house. They didn't give me a phone call. I was sitting at my house with my family, and the detectives came and told us that they found her.
He was like, she's dead. I never cried as many tears in my life.
I would really wish we could have brought her home alive, but we were not able to do that. But if there's any positive to take away from that is that we were able to recover her, to return her home to her loving family so that they could start the closure and the grieving process.
Then, after speaking to Patrice's family, the detectives dig deeper into her ex, Jamir Miller.
We executed a search warrant at Jamir Miller's mother's house, and we recovered some very crucial pieces of evidence.
One of my sergeants was in the backyard next to the garage, and he notices Patrice's bag. It's a bag that she carries her headphones and wallet and things like that.
But that isn't all that the detectives find.
There was some blood stains behind the house, like he had taken the body out, placed it on the ground.
Right then, I knew that what he did was, after the initial abduction and shooting, he threw her behind that garage to go to the car wash to clean it out. So her body sat there for several hours. And at some point, he came back and picked her up, and that's when he dumped the vehicle in Novi.
Inside the house, detectives find clothing that matches what the killer was wearing in the security video.
We ended up finding in the room that he occupied the track suit that had some blood on it.
And they find his sneakers, which has blood on them.
It's enough for the detectives.
So at the time, they really knew the main suspect was her ex-boyfriend, Jamir Miller.
Now all the detectives have to do is find him.
Hoping for a lead, the detectives dig into his police record.
Looking through Jamir's record, they noticed a lot of red flags.
He had some involvement with the federal government and with other agencies within the state of Michigan.
And his most recent brush with the law is only a few weeks old.
His house was raided for being involved in some type of drug trafficking.
He's facing charges on that for a sizable amount of narcotics.
He also had numerous domestic complaints against him.
He looks like he was someone who was a predator, who looked for opportunities to victimize women.
Years before, he had a relationship with someone else, and that person disappeared.
It was like 10 years ago, and she still hasn't been found.
Now they're wondering, did he have something to do with that as well?
The discovery only makes the detectives more determined to get him off the streets.
Our fugitive apprehension team and our special response team were executing a number of search warrants, knocking on doors. We were going to relentlessly pursue him until we got him into custody.
But it's as if they're pursuing a phantom.
No one heard from him, seen him, or talked to him after the abduction.
Until, after days of fruitless searching, he simply walks into the Detroit Police Department and asks to speak to the detectives.
He says, I heard y'all was looking for me.
To walk in is very odd and very strange. Normally, if someone had committed a crime, a murder particularly, they would flee, they would run.
As soon as they're notified that he's out front, Sergeant McIntyre escorts Jamir into an interview room.
This was the person I was responsible for Patrice's death. I was very confident we had the right person.
But Jamir says it's all a big misunderstanding.
My face is everywhere on the news. Why is your face on the news? They trying to say allegedly I did something to my ex-girlfriend.
He knows what's going on. People are calling him, letting him know that the police are looking for him.
Which, according to Jameer, is why he came forward.
I ain't had nothing to run for, nothing to hide, none of that. None.
He basically was saying he had nothing to do with it. He had no involvement.
When was the last time you saw her? Patrice? Yeah. It had to be like April 30th. I dropped some flowers off at her house.
He was playing it cool.
We literally haven't been together, had sex or anything since the end of April. So did it end on a good note? Yeah.
But while Jameer claims that the split was amicable, the detective isn't buying it.
Y'all have any domestic issues?
Jameer admitted that he and Patrice had a very turbulent relationship, but he insisted he was never violent or abusive.
He would never want to hurt her.
However, Jameer doesn't say the same about Patrice.
She stabbed me before.
Jameer Miller has come in to talk with detectives about the abduction and murder of his ex-girlfriend, Patrice Wilson. But he denies having anything to do with her death.
Jameer claimed that the only violence in their relationship came from Patrice, not him.
He had made mention that Patrice had stabbed him.
Wait, she stabbed you?
The police are totally surprised.
Why'd she stab you? She's crazy too. She crazy.
But according to Jameer, he never retaliated when Patrice turned violent.
So you ain't never wanted to hurt her or nothing like that? Hurt her? Yeah. Hell no. What?
The detective isn't buying it, but still, he plays the game.
I mean, flat out, did you kill her? I mean, straight up, right? You gotta ask. No.
Sometimes when you're talking to a subject, it's like a chess match because they don't particularly know how much you know.
Until the detective decides it's time to tip his hand.
So the hospital video sees her being attacked, forced in her car, and the car drive off. Right? Then her car go by your mama's house. Her car went by my mama's house. Uh-huh.
The detectives actually say, hey, wait a minute, we have clothing from your mother's home. We have evidence that both of your phones were in the same locations at the same time.
The police are showing all the evidence to Jameer.
So how we getting around that? Gotta ask my lawyer. I'm asking you. Gotta ask my lawyer.
He shuts down and he says, I don't want to give any more information.
When a person says, I want my lawyer, we just end it.
After the interview, Jameer is booked into the Wayne County Jail.
He was charged with murder, premeditated murder, kidnapping, and a slew of other charges.
While he's in jail, the detectives monitor his calls.
I'm listening to jail calls, the calls he's making to his mother and anybody else. In one call, he is mad with his mother because we found stuff at his house, found evidence at his house.
Jameer gets upset with her because she didn't dispose of certain items.
He expressed to her, I told you to get rid of that stuff. You had 5 hours and you couldn't do that.
The phone call with his mother becomes a critical piece of evidence at Jameer's preliminary hearing.
When that was played at the preliminary, he put his head in his hands like he knew it was done, that he was cooked.
The police lay out all this evidence, and as much as he tried to deny it, he realizes this is not looking good.
Soon after, his attorneys approach the prosecution and come to an agreement.
He accepts a plea deal for second-degree murder if they drop all the other charges.
The prosecutor did the deal because what it does is it spares the family of having to relive what happened to Patrice.
Me going through seeing my child in the trunk, pictures, the trial would have took me overboard.
I definitely supported her mom in the decision not to go through the trial because once you see something, you can't unsee it.
A trial also carries risks that the family isn't willing to take.
At the end of the day, nothing is certain. You have 12 people sitting in a jury box and it only takes one to say, you know what? I don't think you did it. And if the defendant wants to take the plea agreement and own up to what he did, and it's a decent amount of time for what they've done, I'm okay with that.
It's guaranteed time.
But as part of the deal, Jameer provides a statement explaining why he'd gone to the hospital that day.
Jameer is saying that he went to Patrice because she owed him money. And that was the only way he could get his money back by talking to her.
He says there was an argument and it turned into a struggle.
But according to Jameer, he never meant to kill Patrice.
He got startled and the gun went off.
Jameer even claims that he tried to save her.
Oh, God, Patrice, what do I do? What do I do? Put pressure right here.
Jameer said Patrice tried to help him stop the bleeding. Unfortunately, he couldn't.
And once he realized she was dead, he panicked.
Jameer said all he could think to do was to try to cover up what happened.
But police and prosecutors doubt his story.
You could tell in the text messages between the two of them, he was very abusive. He's always apologizing for something he did.
It was a very toxic relationship, and she decided she had had enough and she wanted to be done with him.
It triggered him. It completely triggered him.
He's just the type to not let go. He didn't like the rejection.
And if he couldn't have Patrice, no one could.
According to the prosecutors, that's the real reason he'd gone to the hospital that morning.
He picked up a weapon, he went to a location, he grabbed a costume, he lied in wait.
What he did and how he went about doing it, he had every intentions on getting away with it.
Jameer, stop!
We believe that she was shot right away.
This was no accident. Jameer meant to kill her.
And because of that, he's going to prison for a long time.
Jameer Miller is sentenced to 35 to 60 years in prison.
He has to serve at least 35. So good behavior or not, he's in there that long.
He'll be eligible for parole when he's 70.
That's pretty much a life sentence.
By the time that he gets out of prison, there's not going to be anything left for him out there.
And that's enough for Patrice's family.
Justice for Patrice that day was served for me and her.
But justice can't restore what Jameer took from them and from the entire Detroit community.
Patrice represents all of our daughters, right? I have a 29-year-old daughter myself, and she's obviously made her family very proud. Going to work every day, serving as a nurse in a very busy hospital in Detroit, providing much-needed services to our community. Had her whole life ahead of her.
She lost her life because she was trying to do the right thing.
Patrice did the right thing by leaving her ex-boyfriend.
I told her, I said, you're loved. So there's no reason for you to even have to be in a situation like that. There's no reason at all. I think she wanted to be in a relationship and she struggled, but she was getting there towards the end. And I told her, I said, you gotta learn to be by yourself sometimes.
But just breaking up wasn't enough.
If your ex-boyfriend keeps harassing you or texting you or trying to come to your house, that's when it's time to call police.
If you got one person that you can really tell that will help you get out of it, you tell that person. Because I would have made sure she got out of that. She was an RN and she could go anywhere she wanted to go.
The rain in Sydney never washed away the blood on the asphalt that night in November 2001. It only made it run thinner, spreading the horror across a quiet suburban street while the rest of the city slept soundly under a false sense of security. It was a scene ripped straight from a nightmare, a textbook cold case in the making, the kind of absolute mystery that paralyzes a community, leaving a neighborhood looking over its shoulder for decades while the killer walks among them undetected, smiling in plain sight. 25 years the files sat in the dark, gathering dust in the deep archives of New South Wales Police Headquarters, a monument to human failure, a haunting reminder of a young life violently cut short without justice, without answers, and without a single viable suspect in custody. The headlines back then were frantic, screaming from every newsstand in bold, black ink. Horror in the suburbs, the midnight silhouette. Who killed inside the locked room? But as the months bled into years, those screaming headlines faded into brief, occasional paragraphs buried deep in the back pages, a tragic afterthought of a city moving too fast to remember its dead. The victim was 22-year-old architecture student Clara Vance, a bright, ambitious young woman with her whole life ahead of her, found dead inside her own secure apartment with no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, and absolutely no forensic footprint left behind by the perpetrator. The crime scene was an eerie masterpiece of chilling precision, a clinical execution so meticulously clean that it baffled the most seasoned homicide detectives, leaving them grasping at thin air while the public demanded immediate answers that never came. Neighbors reported hearing nothing but the low, rhythmic thud of the storm outside, no screams, no signs of a struggle, just the oppressive silence of a Tuesday night that would soon become the epicenter of a national obsession. The first officer on the scene described the apartment as an unnatural sanctuary of stillness, the air thick with a faint scent of copper and expensive cologne, a detail that was immediately suppressed from the media to protect the integrity of an investigation that was already doomed from its very inception. For a quarter of a century, the collective psyche of the city carried the weight of this unresolved trauma, the name Clara Vance becoming synonymous with a terrifying reality that monsters do exist, that they eat breakfast next to you, that they ride the same trains, and that sometimes they never get caught. But the true shockwave didn't hit until the cold case unit, armed with advanced, next-generation genetic genealogy and microscopic forensic scanning technology unavailable at the turn of the millennium, reopened the case file to look at the evidence with fresh, unbiased eyes. What they uncovered was not a hidden drifter, not a jilted ex-lover, and not a random predator lurking in the shadows of the harbor, but a betrayal so deep, a twist so profoundly sinister that it sent shockwaves through the entire Australian justice system, shattering public trust in the badge forever. The prime suspect, the individual whose DNA was recently extracted from a microscopic sweat profile found beneath the adhesive of the original crime scene tape, was none other than Detective Sergeant Marcus Thorne, the very man who had led the initial investigation, the brilliant, celebrated investigator who had stood before the television cameras in 2001, vowing to hunt down Clara Vance's killer until his last dying breath. The realization spread through the modern task force like a contagion of pure disbelief, a sickening iron truth dropping into the pit of their stomachs as they realized they were hunting one of their own legends, a man who had built a glittering career on the ashes of the case he had intentionally sabotaged from day one. In 2001, Marcus Thorne was the rising star of the Homicide Squad, a ruthless, sharp-witted detective known for his uncanny ability to get inside the minds of killers, a man trusted implicitly by the Vance family, who wept on his shoulder during press conferences while he promised them closure. He had manipulated the entire narrative, controlled the flow of information to the media, steered junior detectives away from critical timelines, and conveniently lost key pieces of physical evidence that would have pointed the finger directly at his own whereabouts on that fateful November night. The ultimate predator had assigned himself to investigate his own atrocity, creating the perfect alibi, the ultimate shield against suspicion, because who would ever dare to suspect the very man wearing the badge, leading the hunt, and console the grieving mother on national television? The records show Thorne was the first senior detective to arrive at the apartment, arriving even before the forensic team had set up their perimeter, giving him the perfect, unquestioned opportunity to contaminate the scene, to plant red herrings, and to erase his own tracks under the guise of an initial walkthrough. He had constructed a labyrinth of false leads, fabricating anonymous tips that sent teams chasing ghosts across the state, ensuring that the critical first 48 hours, the golden window of any homicide investigation, were completely wasted on dead ends and phantom suspects. The media at the time ate out of his hand, portraying Thorne as the tireless crusader fighting against an impossible, invisible enemy, a narrative he carefully cultivated to mask the dark, sociopathic reality hiding behind his intense, commanding gaze. For 25 years, he lived a life of honor, retiring with a full pension, celebrated at department dinners as a titan of the force, while the ghost of Clara Vance remained trapped in a cardboard box in the evidence locker, waiting for the technology that would finally unmask her protector as her executioner. The arrest was executed in total secrecy, a pre-dawn raid on a luxury coastal property where the retired detective spent his days overlooking the ocean, a tranquil paradise paid for by a lifetime of systemic deceit, now shattered by the heavy boots of the Tactical Operations Unit knocking down his door. When the handcuffs slapped onto Thorne's wrists, neighbors reported he didn't scream. He didn't protest his innocence. He merely looked at the arresting officers with a cold, vacant stare, a man who knew that the clock had finally run out, that the past had finally caught up, and that the ultimate cold case was no longer a mystery, but a masterclass in institutional betrayal. The city now watches in absolute, horrified fascination as the court documents begin to spill into the public domain, revealing the chilling extent of a monster who wore a uniform, a man who used the laws of the land as a weapon to cover his own depravity, leaving a family broken and a city haunted by the terrifying knowledge of who is really watching them from the dark. The ultimate twist in the Sydney 2001 cold case isn't just that the killer was found. It is the devastating, sickening realization that the wolf wasn't just at the door. He was the one running the pack, holding the keys to the kingdom and controlling the searchlight all along. The rain that washed over Sydney on that November night did more than blur the physical evidence. It began a 25-year psychological distortion that twisted the lives of everyone connected to Clara Vance. To understand how a killer could hide behind a gold shield, one must descend directly into the suffocating atmosphere of the original investigation, back to the raw, unedited moments when the trail was fresh and the deception was engineered in real time. The initial dispatch call crackled through the police radio network at precisely 2:15 in the morning, a cold, mechanical voice cutting through the static to disrupt the rhythmic hum of the windshield wipers on Detective Sergeant Marcus Thorne's unmarked sedan. He was already driving through the dark, winding streets of the inner west, moving with a calculated, eerie purpose long before the emergency operators had even finalized the log entry for the incident. When he arrived at the sleek, modern apartment complex in Camperdown, the flashing blue and red lights of the first responding patrol cars were already casting long, distorted shadows against the wet concrete, creating a frantic, strobe-like theater of chaos that he intended to masterfully orchestrate. Thorne did not hesitate, did not wait for his partner, and did not follow the standard operating procedures that he himself had helped write for the New South Wales police force. He adjusted his heavy overcoat, pulled his brimmed hat low against the driving rain, and ducked beneath the hastily erected blue plastic tape that marked the boundary between the ordinary world and a zone of absolute horror. The first responding officers, young, visibly shaken, and wet from the storm, stood in the lobby, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lighting as they recognized the legendary homicide detective stepping into their perimeter. They offered no resistance when he pushed past them without a word, his heavy boots squeaking against the polished terrazzo floor as he made his way toward the elevator, ascending alone to the third floor where the door to Unit 312 stood slightly ajar. The air inside the hallway was thick, heavy with the unmistakable, metallic tang of fresh blood and the underlying, suffocating scent of an expensive, sharp men's cologne that seemed entirely out of place in a student's residence. Stepping across the threshold, Thorne entered a space of absolute, clinical stillness, an environment that felt less like a chaotic crime scene and more like a carefully curated stage where every element had been deliberately positioned to convey a message of total powerlessness. Clara Vance lay on the living room floor, her posture oddly serene despite the immense violence that had been visited upon her body, her eyes open and staring blankly at the ceiling as if she were still trying to comprehend the identity of the monster who had entered her sanctuary. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, and no frantic claw marks on the walls to suggest she had fought for her life against an intruder. The locks on the front door were completely intact, the windows were securely fastened from the inside, and her keys lay untouched on the kitchen counter next to an open textbook and a half-empty cup of herbal tea that was still lukewarm to the touch. It was the classic, terrifying manifestation of a locked room mystery, a scenario that would drive the media into a frenzy of speculation, yet to the trained eye, it screamed of a perpetrator who possessed intimate knowledge of the building, absolute confidence, and in chilling familiarity with the victim herself. Thorne stood over the body for several minutes in complete silence, his expression an unreadable mask of intense concentration that the junior officers downstairs would later mistake for the profound grief of a dedicated lawman witnessing another tragedy. In reality, those minutes were a masterclass in forensic triage, a calculated assessment of his own exposure, a silent inventory of what needed to be altered, suppressed, or completely erased before the forensic specialists arrived with their cameras and chemical sprays. He moved through the apartment with the practiced ease of an apparition, his gloved hands gently adjusting the angle of a lamp, shifting a piece of paper on the desk, and subtly manipulating the environment to ensure that any future reconstruction of the timeline would be fundamentally flawed from the outset. By the time the rest of the homicide squad and the scene of crime officers arrived, breathing heavily and lugging their heavy equipment cases up the stairs, Marcus Thorne was already fully entrenched in his role as the righteous avenger, commanding the room with an authority that brooked no question. He immediately assumed total control of the narrative, directing the forensic team's focus away from the points of entry and toward the balcony, suggesting with a grim, convincing nod that the killer must have been an agile, highly sophisticated stalker who scales the brick facade of the building. This single, authoritative suggestion, delivered with the absolute certainty of a veteran investigator, effectively blinded the team, causing them to spend hours dusting the outside ledges for phantom prints while ignoring the internal door handles and the hallway carpets where actual evidence might have lingered. He stood in the center of the living room, barking orders, assigning tasks, and establishing a perimeter that was intentionally designed to be chaotic, ensuring that his own initial presence and any microscopic traces he might have left behind would be hopelessly confounded by the heavy boots of his subordinates. The flashbulbs of the police cameras began to pop, illuminating the stark, grim reality of the room in sudden, blinding bursts of white light, casting long, monstrous shadows across the walls that seemed to dance to the rhythm of the storm outside. As the morning light began to bleed through the heavy gray clouds over Sydney, casting a cold, unforgiving glare on the wet streets, Thorne stepped out onto the apartment balcony to smoke a cigarette, watching the media vans assemble below like vultures gathering around a fresh kill. Satellite dishes were hoisted into the rainy sky, reporters adjusted their coats and checked their microphones, and the first wave of live broadcasts began to beam the image of the Camperdown apartment complex into millions of homes across the country. The public hunger for information was immediate and insatiable. The brutal murder of a young, beautiful university student in a secure building was the exact brand of sensationalist horror that captivated the collective imagination and stoked the fires of urban paranoia. Thorne watched them all with a cold, detached amusement, knowing that he held the remote control to this entire media circus, that he could feed them crumbs, lead them into blind alleys, and shape the public perception of the killer into whatever terrifying phantom he chose to invent. He descended the stairs to face the gathering crowd of journalists, his face a perfectly constructed tableau of grim determination and weary resolve, the very picture of an unyielding protector of the peace standing between the citizens and the darkness. The microphones were thrust toward his face, a chaotic thicket of plastic and foam, as reporters shouted over one another, demanding to know if women were safe in their own homes, if there was a serial killer stalking the university campus, and if the police had any leads. Thorne raised a single, leather-gloved hand, instantly silencing the clamor with the sheer weight of his presence, his voice booming out across the wet street with a deep, authoritative resonance that commanded absolute trust. "We are dealing with a cowardly, highly calculated individual," he stated, looking directly into the lens of the primary network camera, his eyes unblinking, his tone steady and devoid of doubt. "A dedicated task force has been established, and we will not rest, we will not sleep, until the person responsible for this horrific act is brought to justice and forced to answer for what they have done." The irony was sublime. A private joke shared only between himself and the dead girl upstairs, a display of sociopathic arrogance so profound that it acted as an impenetrable shield against suspicion. Who could ever dare to imagine that the man promising justice on the morning news was the very man who had stood in that same room hours earlier, watching the life drain from Clara Vance's eyes? The psychological manipulation was seamless. By inserting himself as the public face of the hunt, Thorne ensured that any suspicion directed toward the police force would be viewed as an insult to his tireless dedication, effectively insulating himself from the very apparatus he commanded. He returned to the station and formally established Task Force Delta, claiming the premier corner office on the homicide floor, where he immediately began constructing the elaborate labyrinth that would keep the investigation running in circles for the next 2.5 decades. The first step in his grand diversion was the systematic elimination of legitimate avenues of inquiry, a quiet, bureaucratic sabotage that occurred in the shadow of filing cabinets and encrypted database entries. He personally took charge of the victim's personal effects, volunteering to review her diaries, her computer logs, and her phone records under the guise of looking for a hidden stalker or a secret lover who might have possessed a motive for such extreme violence. In doing so, he was able to permanently delete several critical email exchanges and remove specific pages from her journal that detailed an increasingly uncomfortable relationship with a senior law enforcement figure she had met during a university lecture on criminal justice. The junior detectives assigned to the task force were young, eager, and completely intimidated by Thorne's legendary status. They accepted his summaries without question, never asking to see the raw data, never doubting that their leader was giving them the complete, unadulterated truth. Instead of looking close to home, Thorne directed the task force to focus their immense resources on a sweeping, highly visible dragnet of the local transient population, ordering the rounding up and interrogation of dozens of homeless men, known petty criminals, and individuals with histories of mental illness in the inner West. This tactic served a dual purpose. It satisfied the media's demand for aggressive police action, creating a constant stream of headlines about suspects being questioned, while simultaneously ensuring that the investigation was drowning in a sea of useless, low-level data. The interrogation rooms at the station became a revolving door of society's most vulnerable, men who could barely remember where they had slept the night before, let alone account for their movements during the precise window of Clara Vance's murder. Thorne would sit behind the two-way mirror, watching his detectives browbeat these tragic, confused individuals, occasionally stepping into the room himself to deliver a terrifying, theatrical performance of the angry investigator demanding a confession he knew they could never give. The community was frozen in a state of perpetual anxiety, the fear stoked by local tabloids that printed graphic, speculative maps of the killer's supposed hunting grounds, turning every dark alleyway and poorly lit park into a potential death trap. Women in Sydney began carrying whistles, changing their commuting routes, and locking their doors with a frantic, repetitive urgency, completely unaware that the source of their terror was currently sitting in a police cruiser, cleared by the highest authorities to move freely through any security checkpoint in the state. Thorne fed this paranoia deliberately, leaking selective, terrifying details to his favorite crime reporters, details about the clean, surgical nature of the crime, to foster the myth of an unstoppable, genius predator, a modern Jack the Ripper who could slip through walls and vanish into the night without a trace. The more competent, elusive, and otherworldly the killer seemed in the press, the more understandable it would be when Thorne's task force ultimately failed to catch him. But within the ranks of Task Force Delta, a subtle, dangerous friction began to develop as the weeks turned into months and the initial mountain of leads began to dry up into nothingness. A young, fiercely intelligent intelligence analyst named Sarah Lynn began to notice strange anomalies in the case file, patterns that did not align with the narrative of a random, transient predator that Thorne was pushing so aggressively. Lynn spent her nights surrounded by towers of paperwork, cross-referencing cell tower data, security camera footage from neighboring businesses, and the logs of police vehicles assigned to the district on the night of the murder. She discovered a terrifying, inexplicable gap, a 3-hour window during the storm where a specific, unmarked police vehicle had its automated location tracking manually deactivated, a vehicle that was registered to the homicide pool but possessed no official assignment log for that specific time period. Furthermore, her analysis of the nearby street cameras revealed a brief, blurry glimpse of a dark, late-model sedan passing through an intersection 2 blocks from Clara Vance's apartment at precisely 2 in the morning, 15 minutes before the body was officially reported. The silhouette of the driver was obscured by the torrential rain and the glare of the streetlights, but the make and model matched the unmarked vehicles utilized exclusively by senior homicide staff. Excitement mixed with a creeping, instinctual dread as Lynn realized she might have uncovered a critical piece of the puzzle, a rogue cop who had witnessed something, or worse, an officer who was neglecting his duties during a major crime. She did not suspect the truth, not yet, because the human mind naturally rebels against an idea so monstrous, but she knew she had to bring this information to the head of the task force, the one man she trusted to follow the truth wherever it led. The confrontation, if it could even be called that, took place late on a Friday evening when the rest of the floor was empty and the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muted roar of the weekend traffic on the streets below. Lynn walked into Thorne's office, her hands trembling slightly as she laid out the spreadsheets, the camera stills, and the vehicle logs across his expansive wooden desk, her voice eager as she explained the geographic anomaly and the missing tracking data. Thorne sat perfectly still, his large hands folded neatly over his stomach, his face shadowed by the single desk lamp as he listened to her presentation without interrupting, his eyes tracking her every movement with a cold, calculating precision of a reptile sizing up its prey. When she finished, there was a long, agonizing silence in the room, a stillness so profound that Lynn could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall and the sound of her own rapid breathing. Thorne did not panic. He did not raise his voice or show even a flicker of anger or concern. Instead, he let out a low, patronizing chuckle, a sound that sent a sudden, inexplicable shiver down Lynn's spine, before leaning forward into the light, his expression shifting into one of deep, paternal concern. "It's excellent work, Sarah. Truly sharp analysis," he said, his voice smooth, warm, and entirely reassuring. "But you're seeing ghosts where there are only bureaucratic mistakes. That vehicle log was handled by a veteran sergeant who forgot to log out before going off shift, and that sedan you see on the camera belongs to a surveillance team working a completely unrelated drug operation that we can't disclose for national security reasons." He reached out, his massive hand covering her printouts, slowly pulling them across the desk and sliding them into a drawer that he locked with a sharp, definitive click. "Forget about this line of inquiry. It's a dead end. And if you breathe a word of this to the media or anyone outside this room, you'll ruin a multi-million-dollar operation and destroy your own career before it even starts. Do you understand me?" The threat was implicit, wrapped in the protective gauze of professional advice, but the look in Thorne's eyes was unmistakable. It was a gaze of pure, unadulterated malice, a warning that she was standing on the edge of an abyss. Lynn felt a sudden, suffocating wave of fear wash over her, her professional instincts screaming at her to back down, to survive, to retreat into the safety of compliance. She nodded slowly, her face pale as she excused herself from the office, leaving the room with the terrifying realization that the corruption within the investigation did not come from the outside. It was embedded deep within the leadership itself. Within 48 hours, Lynn was abruptly transferred out of the homicide squad and reassigned to a remote, low-level administrative desk in the far west of the state, her career effectively sidelined, her files locked away in Thorne's private cabinet where they would never see the light of day again. With the internal threat neutralized, Thorne moved to permanently cement the case's status as an insolvable mystery, executing his final, most audacious act of administrative destruction. He entered the high-security evidence vault at the station, utilizing his senior authorization codes to access the physical items recovered from Unit 312 on the morning of the murder. Working in the blind spots of the vault's outdated camera system, he carefully removed the original vaginal swabs and the fingernail scrapings taken from Clara Vance's body, the only items that could potentially contain the perpetrator's DNA, and replaced them with generic, sterile substitutes that had been exposed to room air, ensuring they would yield nothing but degraded, useless results if ever tested in the future. He then intentionally mislabeled the storage boxes, filing them under an incorrect case number in a completely different section of the archive, effectively burying the physical truth beneath a mountain of clerical errors. By the one-year anniversary of the murder, Task Force Delta was quietly disbanded, its resources diverted to newer, more pressing crimes, its legacy one of total and absolute failure. Thorne stood before the television cameras one last time, his hair now flecked with gray, his expression a masterpiece of tragic resignation as he announced that all leads had been exhausted, but that the case would remain open indefinitely. "We have chased every whisper, examined every fragment of evidence," he said to the solemn reporters, his voice heavy with a manufactured sorrow that moved the public to tears. "The monster who did this has vanished into the ether, but I promise the Vance family, and I promise the people of Sydney, that we will never truly stop looking." The deception was complete, a flawless execution of a systemic cover-up that left a family broken, a community permanently scarred, and a killer free to ascend the ranks of the police force, celebrated as a hero, while the truth lay rotting in a misplaced box in the dark. For 25 years, Marcus Thorne lived the life of an untouchable king, a man who had committed the perfect crime and used the very machinery of justice to erase his own footsteps, completely unaware that time is an unyielding enemy and that the future was bringing a digital dawn that no amount of administrative malice could ever hope to suppress. The passing of 2 decades did not soften the grief that clung to the Vance family home, nor did it lessen the shadow that lingered over the city's collective memory, but inside the sprawling archives of the New South Wales Police Force, the silence was absolute. Year after year, the cardboard boxes containing the remnants of Clara Vance's life sat undisturbed on cold steel shelving, a collection of static relics trapped in a bureaucratic purgatory, while the world outside underwent a profound digital revolution. Typewriters and paper ledgers were completely replaced by high-speed servers, localized fingerprint cards gave way to global biometric networks, and the science of human identification shifted from macro-level observations to the microscopic manipulation of the genetic code. By the mid-2020s, a new generation of investigators had taken the reins of law enforcement, young men and women who possessed no loyalty to the old guard, no memory of the political alliances that defined the early 2000s, and an unshakable faith in the absolute, objective truth of science. Among them was Detective Inspector Elena Vance, no relation to the victim, but a woman whose fierce, analytical mind made her the natural choice to lead the newly modernized Unresolved Homicide Squad. Elena did not rely on gut instincts or the romanticized notions of detective work that had propelled men like Marcus Thorne to stardom. She believed implicitly in data, in cold efficiency, and in the fundamental principle that every perpetrator leaves an indelible, microscopic signature at the scene of their crime, no matter how hard they try to erase it. When her team launched an algorithmic audit of all outstanding cold cases from the turn of the millennium, Clara Vance's name immediately flagged to the top of the priority list, not because of the sensationalized media history, but because the original file was filled with glaring administrative anomalies that defied all logic. The missing tracking data, the abrupt transfer of intelligence analyst Sarah Lynn, the oddly rapid dissolution of Task Force Delta, and the complete lack of cohesive forensic matching, it all pointed toward a deliberate, systemic failure rather than simple incompetence. Elena ordered the immediate retrieval of all physical evidence associated with Unit 312, a directive that triggered a frantic, week-long search through the mislabeled, dusty labyrinth of the deep repository. When the boxes were finally located, tucked away in a damp basement corner under an entirely different classification code, the forensic technicians discovered exactly what Marcus Thorne had done 25 years prior to ensure his protection. The primary evidence bags containing the biological swabs had been intentionally compromised, the seals broken and resealed with outdated police tape, the internal samples degraded to the point of utter uselessness by deliberate exposure to air and moisture. To an ordinary investigator, this discovery would have been the definitive end of the road, a frustrating confirmation that the passage of time and administrative malice had permanently stolen justice from the victim. But Elena Vance was not an ordinary investigator, and the year 2026 offered technological weapons that the corrupt old guard could never have anticipated when they committed their acts of sabotage in the dark. She shifted the team's focus away from the corrupted biological samples and toward the peripheral items that had been touched, moved, or utilized by the investigative team during that fateful initial walkthrough in November 2001. Specifically, her eyes fixed on the original rolls of high-visibility adhesive crime scene tape that had been used to seal the doors and windows of the apartment after the body was removed, a material that Thorne himself had handled extensively before the specialized forensic units had even arrived on site. Under the intense, sterile glare of the laboratory's next-generation forensic scanners, the back of the adhesive tape revealed a hidden treasure trove of microscopic matter that had remained perfectly preserved and sealed away from the elements for a quarter of a century. When a human being sweats, breathes, or sheds microscopic skin cells, they leave behind an invisible trail of cellular debris, and when Thorne had forcefully torn that adhesive tape with his gloved but sweating hands, a minute amount of his biological profile had bypassed the fabric barrier, becoming permanently trapped beneath the industrial glue. Using an advanced, ultra-sensitive extraction technique known as touch DNA amplification, the forensic scientists were able to isolate a pristine, undegraded genetic sequence from the adhesive backing, a digital map of a human being consisting of millions of base pairs that had never been entered into any standard criminal database. The system ran the profile against the National DNA Database, returning an immediate, frustrating blank. Whoever this individual was, they had never been arrested, never fingerprinted, and never convicted of a crime in the modern era. But the modern cold case unit did not stop at government borders or institutional databases. They utilized the highly controversial, deeply revolutionary science of investigative genetic genealogy, uploading the unknown profile into global, public-facing ancestral tracking networks used by millions of ordinary citizens to discover their family trees. The algorithmic search rippled through millions of global profiles, crossing generations, continents, and family lineages, slowly building a complex web of genetic connections that began to narrow down with terrifying, mathematical precision toward a single, prominent family tree based in New South Wales. Within 48 hours, the digital genealogy software had eliminated millions of possibilities, tracing the lineage down through cousins, uncles, and grandparents until the apex of the pyramid pointed directly and undeniably at a single individual. When the final notification popped up on Elena Vance's terminal screen, the name that flashed in bright white text did not belong to a transient stalker, an unidentified drifter, or a deceased criminal. It was the name of a living legend, a retired titan of the homicide squad whose portrait still hung in the academy hallway as an inspiration to every young cadet. Marcus Thorne. The atmosphere inside the cold case briefing room instantly turned to sub-zero ice, the air turning heavy with a collective, paralyzing disbelief as the detectives stared at the screen, their minds desperately trying to reject the objective reality staring them in the face. It was an institutional catastrophe of the highest order, a revelation that threatened to tear down the credibility of 25 years of police work, to reopen dozens of Thorne's highly publicized convictions, and to expose the dark, rotting underbelly of a department that had protected a monster under the guise of heroism. Elena stood at the head of the table, her jaw set, her expression turning into a mask of pure steel as she realized the immense danger of the situation. If Thorne received even a single whisper that his past was catching up to him, his extensive network of retired and active contacts would instantly warn him, allowing him to destroy remaining evidence or flee the country before justice could strike. She immediately placed the entire task force under a total, ironclad communication blackout, confiscating personal mobile phones, disconnecting the briefing room from the general station network, and authorizing a highly restricted, top-secret surveillance operation on the retired detective sergeant. The target was living out his twilight years in a magnificent, multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece perched high on the cliffs of the northern beaches, a home that overlooked the vast, churning waters of the Pacific Ocean, bought and paid for by a lucrative retirement pension and the fruits of a celebrated career built on a foundation of blood and lies. For 2 weeks, undercover surveillance vehicles monitored his every movement, capturing high-definition footage of a fit, white-haired 75-year-old man who still walked with the commanding, arrogant posture of a lawman who believed he owned the city. He read the morning papers, drank expensive coffee on his sun-drenched balcony, and occasionally met with old police buddies at local clubs, laughing and sharing stories of the old days, completely unaware that the invisible net of the modern world was tightening around his neck with every passing second. The surveillance team's primary objective was to secure a fresh, undeniable reference sample of Thorne's DNA without his knowledge, a contemporary match that would eliminate any potential legal loophole or claim of historic evidence contamination in a future court of law. The opportunity finally presented itself on a crisp, clear Thursday afternoon when Thorne visited an upscale, isolated cafe near the marina, sitting alone at an outdoor table while reading a true crime biography that featured a prominent chapter on his own legendary investigative career. He finished his double espresso, left a cash tip on the table, and walked away into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a pristine porcelain cup that he had held firmly with his bare right hand, his saliva still coating the rim. Within 30 seconds of his departure, an undercover operative disguised as a utility worker moved in, carefully bagging the cup with sterile tongs and securing it inside a temperature-controlled transport case destined for the forensic lab. The comparative analysis was completed under emergency authorization in the dead of night, the laboratory machines working with a silent, digital certainty to compare the saliva profile from the coffee cup with a 25-year-old touch DNA recovered from the crime scene adhesive tape. The result was a definitive, flawless 100% match. The probability of the DNA belonging to any other individual on the Australian continent was 1 in several hundred billion. There was no longer any room for doubt, no bureaucratic excuse, and no political shield that could save him. The greatest homicide detective in the history of the department was, without a shadow of a doubt, the brutal executioner of Clara Vance. The mobilization for the arrest was handled with the strategic precision of a counterterrorism operation, utilizing a heavily vetted tactical operations unit that was brought in from an outside jurisdiction to ensure absolute secrecy and zero leaks. At 4:30 on a Tuesday morning, while a thick, heavy sea mist rolled off the ocean and enveloped the cliffs of the northern beaches in a ghostly white shroud, 3 unmarked black tactical vans rolled silently down Thorne's private driveway, their headlights extinguished, their occupants moving with lethal, quiet intent. The tactical officers, dressed in full black body armor and carrying heavy breaching equipment, surrounded the perimeter of the luxury villa, setting up containment lines along the cliffside paths and the lower garage doors to prevent any potential escape attempt. Elena Vance stood in the shadow of the lead vehicle, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice perfectly calm as she gave the final order to breach the property, the sound of the explosive door charge shattering the morning silence like a thunderclap. The heavy glass front doors disintegrated into a million glittering shards as the tactical team surged across the threshold, their flashlights cutting through the dark interior of the mansion as they flooded the master bedroom, their weapons trained on the bed where the retired detective lay. Thorne sat up instantly, his eyes wide with a sudden, primal panic that vanished within a fraction of a second, replaced almost immediately by a cold, calculating mask of absolute indifference as he realized the identity of the men standing in his bedroom. He did not fight, he did not scream his innocence, and he did not ask why they were there. He merely looked at the heavy steel handcuffs being lowered onto his wrists, then looked directly into Elena Vance's eyes with a chilling, dead expression that contained no remorse, no fear, and no humanity. As they led him out of his mansion in his silk pajamas, his hands secured behind his back, the first rays of the morning sun began to pierce through the sea mist, illuminating a scene that would instantly become the defining image of the decade. The news broke across the nation like a seismic shockwave, a sudden, devastating flash on every television screen and digital news feed that stopped the city in its tracks. Sydney 2001 cold case solved. Legendary homicide chief arrested for murder. The public reaction was a volatile mix of utter bewilderment and white-hot fury, a collective realization that the man who had been trusted to protect them, the man who had comforted a weeping family on national television, was the very monster who had brought darkness into their world. The trial that followed was a masterclass in cinematic tension, a daily unfolding of horrors as prosecutors systematically dismantled 25 years of deception, presenting the digital forensics, the genealogy records, and the recovered journals of Clara Vance that proved Thorne's obsessive, predatory behavior. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity every single day, the air thick with tension as the public watched the once untouchable titan of the law sit confined within a secure glass dock, stripped of his authority, his medals, and his unearned honor, facing the ultimate reckoning that he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. When the jury delivered its verdict of guilty on all counts, a collective, audible gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a profound, heavy silence that seemed to stretch across the entire city, a realization that the long nightmare was finally over, but that the scars left behind would never truly heal. Marcus Thorne was sentenced to spend the remainder of his natural life behind the bleak, concrete walls of a maximum security prison, a fittingly sterile end for a man who had lived his life with such clinical, sociopathic precision, leaving him alone with the ghosts of his past and the knowledge that his ultimate masterpiece of deception had been entirely destroyed by the unyielding march of truth. The rain still falls on the streets of Sydney, and the apartment complex in Camperdown still stands as a silent monument to that terrible night in 2001, but the air feels lighter now, the oppressive mystery lifted, leaving behind only the enduring, haunting lesson that the greatest monsters are often the ones we trust to hunt them down. The legal aftermath of Marcus Thorne's arrest did not merely disrupt the status quo. It initiated a profound institutional collapse, a systemic demolition of public confidence that forced the entire Australian judicial apparatus to re-examine the very nature of authority, power, and deception. To truly grasp the magnitude of the horror that gripped Sydney in the weeks following the raid on the Cliffside mansion, one must look closely at the hidden ledger of Thorne's 25-year career, a sprawling, dark tapestry of manipulated evidence, coerced confessions, and buried files that extended far beyond the single tragedy of Clara Vance. The state government immediately declared a legal state of emergency, appointing a high-powered, independent royal commission with sweeping powers to audit every single homicide investigation that Thorne had touched, supervised, or influenced since he first donned the detective's gold shield in the late 1990s. The realization that a serial predator might have been operating with total impunity under the protection of the badge sent a wave of absolute panic through the legal community as defense attorneys across the country began preparing massive, unprecedented appeals to overturn dozens of high-profile convictions that Thorne had secured through his celebrated, aggressive tactics. Inside the secure, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Supreme Court building, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, packed to maximum capacity with international journalists, legal scholars, and an anxious, deeply unsettled public that watched the proceedings with a mixture of morbid fascination and white-hot rage. Thorne sat inside the heavily fortified glass dock, no longer the imposing, sharply dressed commander of the homicide squad, but a diminished, white-haired old man wearing a standard-issue prison tracksuit, his hands resting quietly on his lap, as if he were merely an observer at his own funeral. Yet, beneath that fragile, elderly facade, his eyes remained sharp, cold, and entirely vacant of remorse, occasionally tracking the movements of the prosecutors with a lingering, predatory focus that proved the sociopathic fire inside him had not been extinguished by the handcuffs. The prosecution strategy was designed to be a relentless, clinical execution of facts, a presentation so mathematically airtight that it would completely bypass Thorne's anticipated defense that the historical evidence had been contaminated or planted by political enemies within the department. The lead Crown prosecutor, a formidable legal mind named Julian Vance. Ironically sharing a surname with the victim but possessing no biological relation, began the opening address by projecting a massive, high-definition digital timeline across the courtroom's central screens. The presentation did not start with the gruesome details of the crime scene, but with a highly detailed, minute-by-minute analysis of Marcus Thorne's financial records, internal travelogues, and private phone accounts dating back to the winter of 2001. Julian Vance demonstrated to the court that Thorne had developed an intense, highly covert obsession with Clara Vance 6 months before her death, utilizing his unrestricted access to police intelligence databases to stalk her digital footprint, track her university class schedules, and monitor her personal associations without her knowledge or consent. This revelation caused a collective, audible gasp to ripple through the public gallery as the family of Clara Vance wept openly, realizing for the first time that their daughter's nightmare had begun long before the fateful night the lock on her door was bypassed. The prosecution then introduced the most devastating, unassailable piece of evidence recovered from the pre-dawn raid on Thorne's coastal estate, a hidden, highly secure digital server disguised as an ordinary network router in his private study. Forensic computer analysts had spent weeks cracking the military-grade encryption keys, eventually unlocking a hidden archive of hundreds of high-resolution digital photographs, audio recordings, and scanned diary pages that Thorne had systematically stolen from Unit 312 during his initial walkthrough on the morning of the murder. He had kept these items not as trophies in a conventional sense, but as an administrative insurance policy, a highly organized digital vault that allowed him to relive the absolute control he had exerted over the victim and the subsequent investigation. Among the recovered files was a brief, terrifying audio recording captured on a hidden device inside Clara's apartment days before her death, a recording that captured Thorne's voice, low, calm, and utterly menacing, warning her that no one would ever believe her if she tried to report his unwanted advances to the authorities. The defense team, led by a highly paid, notoriously ruthless criminal barrister named Arthur Pendleton, attempted to construct a narrative of institutional conspiracy, arguing aggressively that the 25-year-old touch DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene adhesive tape was a modern fabrication, a targeted frame-up engineered by a corrupt element within the modern police force, seeking to scapegoat a retired legend for their own historic failures. Pendleton paced the courtroom floor, his voice booming with theatrical indignation as he pointed at the glass dock, demanding to know how a man with Thorne's unblemished record, a man who had received the highest commendations for bravery and public service, could suddenly be transformed into an unfeeling monster based entirely on microscopic cellular debris that had sat in an unsecured archive for 2 decades. He cross-examined the modern forensic technicians with a vicious, mocking precision, attempting to exploit the minute margins of error inherent in investigative genetic genealogy, trying to convince the jury that the DNA match was nothing more than a statistical anomaly, a phantom generated by an overzealous algorithm. But the prosecution was prepared for this exact line of attack, countering Pendleton's theatricality with the absolute, unyielding weight of physical reality. Julian Vance called to the stand the retired intelligence analyst, Sarah Lynn, the woman Marcus Thorne had ruthlessly silenced and exiled to a remote administrative post in 2001 when she had come too close to uncovering his missing vehicle logs and the tracking data anomalies. Now in her early 50s, her face etched with the lines of a career stolen from her by systemic corruption, Lynn stood in the witness box with an absolute, quiet dignity that instantly captivated the courtroom. She detailed the exact conversation that had taken place in Thorne's dimly lit office 25 years prior, recalling with chilling precision the exact tone of his voice, the physical theft of her data spreadsheets, and the implicit, terrifying threat that had forced her to retreat into a lifetime of terrified compliance. Her testimony was the final, critical piece of structural scaffolding the prosecution needed. She provided the human context to the digital forensics, proving to the jury that Thorne's deception was not a passive mistake, but an active, aggressive operation designed to crush any individual who threatened his absolute security. As the weeks of the trial bled into one another, the city of Sydney remained trapped in a state of suspended animation, the daily news broadcasts delivering a constant, sickening stream of revelations that forced a deep, collective introspection. The myth of the heroic, lone wolf detective who breaks the rules to deliver justice was permanently shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that the rules are often broken to conceal the most profound depravity imaginable. The public began to look at every high-profile conviction from that era with an intense, unyielding skepticism, wondering how many innocent individuals were currently sitting in maximum security cells because they had the misfortune of being assigned to an investigation led by Detective Sergeant Marcus Thorne. The psychological damage to the collective psyche was immeasurable. The gold shield, once a symbol of ultimate protection and societal order, had been permanently exposed as the ultimate camouflage for a predator who understood that the best place to hide a body is beneath the spotlight of a public investigation. The climax of the trial arrived when Marcus Thorne, against the frantic, explicit advice of his legal counsel, exercised his right to take the stand in his own defense, a decision born out of the pure, unadulterated hubris that had defined his entire life. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the television cameras as Thorne slowly stepped out of the glass dock and walked toward the witness box, his posture straightening, his voice regaining that deep, authoritative resonance that had once commanded absolute obedience from the entire department. He looked directly at the jury, his expression one of calm, patronizing amusement, as if he were a schoolmaster preparing to lecture a room of slow-witted children who had completely misunderstood a basic lesson. For the first 2 hours of his testimony, he spun a seamless, highly compelling narrative of a dedicated lawman who had been forced to make impossible choices in the dark to keep the city safe from chaos, attempting to frame the administrative anomalies and the missing files as necessary, tactical decisions made during a chaotic, high-pressure era of policing. But Julian Vance did not engage in a rhetorical debate with the monster. He waited patiently until Thorne had fully committed to his performance, then launched a devastating, rapid-fire cross-examination that systematically stripped away his mask of calculated composure. Vance did not ask about the police protocols or the vehicle logs. He focused entirely on the final minutes of Clara Vance's life, projecting a massive, high-definition image of her secure apartment door onto the screen, demanding that Thorne explain exactly how an intruder could enter a deadbolt residence without a single scratch on the lock unless they possessed the master electronic keycard issued exclusively to senior homicide investigators for emergency wellness checks. Thorne hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hands tightening against the edge of the witness box, his cold eyes narrowing as he realized he had been caught in a geometric trap from which there was no logical escape. Vance did not let up, his voice rising, delivering a sequence of questions that hit Thorne like physical blows, forcing the retired detective to confront the undeniable reality of his own cellular debris, the encrypted server, and the testimony of the woman he had tried to destroy 25 years earlier. "You didn't look for the killer because you were the killer," Vance shouted across the courtroom, his finger pointing directly at Thorne's face. "You wore the badge to cover the blood, you used the sirens to drown out her screams, and you spent 25 years basking in the unearned praise of a city you betrayed from the very moment you stepped across that threshold. Look at her family, Marcus. Look at them, and tell them how it felt to watch them weep while you sat in their living room, pretending to be their protector." The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Stripped of his administrative armor, exposed in the brilliant, unforgiving light of objective science, Marcus Thorne's calculated, elderly persona completely disintegrated, revealing the raw, venomous sociopathy that lay beneath. He did not weep, he did not beg for mercy, and he did not deny the accusation. Instead, he leaned forward over the witness box, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice as he let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. "You think you've won something here today?" Thorne spat, his voice dropping into a guttural, terrifying register that sent a visible wave of fear through the front rows of the gallery. "You people sit in your clean, safe homes because men like me are willing to walk in the mud. Clara Vance was a distraction, an irrelevance. I built the city's homicide squad with my own bare hands. I caught the real monsters. I kept the peace." You have no right to judge the choices I made to maintain order in a world you are too weak to understand. The confession, delivered with a chilling, defiant arrogance, was the final, definitive nail in his coffin, a moment of pure, unedited psychological horror that left no doubt in the minds of the jury or the public. The defense team sat in stunned, defeated silence, their hands over their faces as they realized their client had just single-handedly dismantled any remaining hope of a legal loophole or an acquittal. The judge immediately terminated the proceedings, ordering Thorne to be removed from the court and returned to the maximum security holding cells while the jury retired to deliberate on a verdict that had already been decided by the killer's own monstrous words. The deliberation took less than 45 minutes, just enough time for the 12 citizens to sign the paperwork that would permanently erase Marcus Thorne from the society he had preyed upon for a quarter of a century. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood and delivered the word guilty with a sharp, definitive force that felt like the closing of a massive steel vault door, a sound that brought an immediate, overwhelming wave of emotion to the Vance family, who collapsed into each other's arms in a state of absolute, exhausted catharsis. The judge did not delay sentencing, delivering a scathing, historic dressing down that would be studied in law schools for generations to come, condemning Thorne to consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his natural life confined within a sterile, concrete box, stripped of his name, his rank, and his humanity. He was immediately transported under heavy military escort to the Supermax facility at Goulburn, a fortress designed to hold the state's most dangerous, irredeemable criminals, a place where his past achievements meant absolutely nothing, and where he would be forced to exist in absolute isolation until his dying breath. The city of Sydney woke up the following morning to a world that felt fundamentally altered. The heavy, oppressive weight of a 25-year mystery finally lifted, yet replaced by a lingering, unsettling chill that no amount of justice could ever truly dispel. The apartment complex in Camperdown remained standing, its windows reflecting the gray, neutral light of a new dawn, a quiet monument to a young life that had been violently stolen by the very man trusted to protect it. The headlines were no longer frantic or sensational. They were solemn, printing Clara Vance's portrait on the front page, without the words cold case or unsolved hovering over her name like a curse. She was finally allowed to rest, her memory untangled from the web of deception that had held her captive for a quarter of a century, while the man who had engineered her oblivion sat alone in the dark, watching the shadows lengthen across his concrete cell, a living monument to the terrifying truth that the greatest evil is often the one wearing the uniform of your protector. The iron doors of Goulburn Supermax did not just swallow Marcus Thorne. They sealed away a living archive of institutional corruption that the state of New South Wales was now desperately forced to exhume. While the former detective sergeant began his first winter inside a 2-by-3-meter concrete cell, stripped of his tailored suits and reduced to an alphanumeric inmate number, the legal and social structure of Sydney was undergoing a violent, uncontrollable detoxification. The Royal Commission into High-Profile Homicide Convictions, established in the immediate wake of Thorne's conviction, had converted 3 entire floors of a secure government building in the central business district into a high-intensity forensic audit hub. Rows of long folding tables groaned under the weight of thousands of cardboard archival boxes, each one representing a life disrupted, a family broken, and a verdict secured by a man whose entire career was now recognized as an elaborate exercise in sociopathic manipulation. The scope of the investigation was staggering, a logistical nightmare that paralyzed the department's current operations. Investigators were not just looking for technical errors, they were looking for a specific, sinister methodology, the Thorne signature. It was a pattern of behavior characterized by the early contamination of crime scenes, the aggressive intimidation of low-level witnesses, the convenient misplacement of alternative suspect profiles, and the calculated use of the media to create a narrative of absolute certainty before a case even reached a courtroom. The deeper the commission dug into the archives from 1998 to 2015, the more they realized that Clara Vance was not an isolated aberration, but the tragic, inevitable culmination of a lifetime of unchecked authority and systemic protection. The public's initial catharsis following the guilty verdict quickly curdled into a profound, lingering cynicism that infected every aspect of civil society. Trust in law enforcement dropped to historic lows, manifested not in loud protests, but in a quiet, pervasive non-cooperation that crippled standard street-level policing across the metropolitan area. Citizens refused to answer basic questions from patrol officers. Witnesses refused to sign statements without private legal counsel present, and juries became deeply, inherently skeptical of any forensic evidence presented by the prosecution that did not possess a multi-layered, independent digital chain of custody. The Gold Shield, once viewed as a bulwark against the rising tide of urban chaos, was now widely regarded in the popular culture as a license for absolute immunity, a terrifying mask that allowed the wolf to police the sheep with the full backing of the state's executive power. Inside the commission's secure war room, Detective Inspector Elena Vance and her elite team of untainted analysts were currently focusing their energy on 3 specific historic homicides from the early 2000s, cases where Thorne had been the lead investigator and had secured swift, highly publicized convictions that had propelled him up the promotional ladder. The first was the 1999 murder of a wealthy philanthropist in Bellevue Hill. The second, the 2003 disappearance of a young mother from the northern beaches. And the third, the 2005 fatal stabbing of a dock worker in the Harbor District. As Elena cross-referenced the original evidence ledgers with modern forensic databases, she discovered the same chilling anomalies that had broken open the Clara Vance case: missing vehicle logs, unrecorded initial walk-throughs by Thorne before the arrivals of the official forensic teams, and biological samples that had miraculously degraded or vanished entirely from the high-security vaults. The realization was sickening. Marcus Thorne had not just killed Clara Vance. He had spent decades using his position to protect other predators, trading administrative immunity for leverage, or worse, framing innocent, vulnerable individuals to maintain his flawless clearance rate and keep his professional reputation immaculate. Her team began tracking down the original suspects who had been dismissed by Thorne during those investigations, individuals whose alibis had been labeled unreliable or whose statements had been altered in the official typewritten summaries. What they found was a trail of administrative devastation, men and women whose lives had been systematically destroyed by a predatory system that prioritized a swift conviction over the preservation of human justice. The most egregious example of this administrative malice was found in the file of the 2005 Harbor stabbing, where a young Indigenous man named David Lang had been sentenced to 20 years for a crime he had steadfastly denied committing from the moment of his arrest. Thorne had built the entire case against Lang on a single, anonymous tip and a blood-stained jacket recovered from a communal laundry room 3 blocks from the scene, a jacket that the defense had argued at the time had been planted by police. Elena ordered the immediate forensic retesting of the microscopic fibers trapped within the seams of that jacket using modern vacuum immersion technology that did not exist during the original trial. The results, delivered on a rainy Tuesday morning that mirrored the weather of 25 years prior, hit the task force like a physical blow. The DNA on the collar did not belong to David Lang, nor did it belong to the victim. It belonged to an active, known informant who had been on Marcus Thorne's private payroll for over a decade. The implication was clear, monstrous, and legally catastrophic. Thorne had actively fabricated evidence to secure a conviction, sacrificing an innocent young man to protect a criminal asset who possessed information that could have exposed Thorne's own illicit activities. Within 48 hours of this discovery, the Court of Criminal Appeal issued an emergency writ, overturning David Lang's conviction and ordering his immediate release from custody after serving more than 2 decades in maximum security confinement for a murder he had no part in. The image of Lang walking out of the prison gates, gray-haired, frail, and blinking into the harsh sunlight of a world he no longer recognized, became another devastating indictment of the system Thorne had commanded, fueling an already volatile public fury that demanded a total, root and branch demolition of the homicide squad. As the corporate media landscape feasted on these daily revelations of corruption, a parallel psychological drama was unfolding within the bleak, concrete walls of Goulburn Supermax, where Marcus Thorne was proving to be a highly uncooperative, deeply unsettling inmate. He spent his days in absolute administrative segregation, forbidden from interacting with the general prison population for his own protection, the department well aware that a former high-profile homicide cop would survive less than an hour in the main yard. Yet, despite the isolation, the deprivation of his luxury lifestyle, and the complete loss of his societal standing, Thorne did not exhibit the typical psychological collapse common among late-life inmates. He maintained a rigid, almost military discipline within his cell, rising at 5 a.m. to perform calisthenics, keeping his state-issued green uniform meticulously ironed, and spending hours writing long, dense letters to an unknown recipient using a blunt, security-approved plastic pen. Prison guards assigned to his sector reported an eerie, pervasive discomfort when monitoring his cell through the closed-circuit television monitors. Thorne would frequently spend hours sitting perfectly still on the edge of his steel bunk, staring directly into the lens of the security camera with a faint, knowing smile playing across his lips, as if he were still privy to a secret that the world outside was desperately trying to uncover. He refused all requests for media interviews, ignoring the multi-million-dollar offers from television networks eager to secure the first exclusive sit-down with the fallen legend. He also refused to meet with the representatives of the Royal Commission, turning his back on Elena Vance when she visited the facility, his voice a low, gravelly whisper as he spoke through the perforated steel door. "You have your little pieces of paper, Elena. You have your digital toys. But you don't have the grand design. You never will." This refusal to speak only intensified the anxiety that gripped the upper echelons of the police department and the state government. The terrifying question that lingered in every private meeting behind closed doors was not what Thorne had done, but who had helped him do it, and how far the network of complicity extended into the current leadership structure of the force. A man does not control a major homicide squad for 2 decades, alter evidence in high-security vaults, and silence intelligence analysts without the active assistance or the deliberate, calculated blindness of superior officers, judges, and politicians who benefited from his high clearance rates and political favors. The fear that Thorne would eventually decide to talk, to trade the names of his former accomplices for a transfer to a less restrictive facility or a reduction in his security classification, hung over the Parliament House like a sword of Damocles, threatening to trigger a political crisis that could bring down the sitting government. The tension reached a boiling point when the Commission uncovered a private leather-bound ledger during a secondary, highly invasive search of Thorne's coastal property, a document that had been concealed behind a false wall panel in the lower wine cellar. This ledger did not contain names or dates in a conventional format, but rather a complex, highly secure cipher consisting of thousands of numeric strings and geographic coordinates that appeared to map out safe deposit boxes, hidden storage units, and encrypted digital accounts spread across international jurisdictions. Elena Vance brought in the nation's top military codebreakers to analyze the ledger, realizing that this document was Thorne's true masterpiece, a comprehensive blackmail archive, an institutional kill switch designed to ensure that if he ever went down, he would take the entire legal framework of the state down with him. The city of Sydney, meanwhile, began to feel like a theater of ghosts, where every major landmark, every quiet suburban street, and every historical crime scene was now viewed through the distorting lens of Thorne's deception. The apartment complex in Camperdown where Clara Vance had lost her life became a site of somber pilgrimage for an entire generation of young women who saw her tragedy as an emblem of a deeper, systemic vulnerability, a reminder that the institutions built to protect them could be turned into instruments of total, inescapable terror. The local media began producing retrospective documentaries that re-examined the entire cultural landscape of the early 2000s, portraying that era not as a time of prosperity and Olympic celebration, but as a dark, permissive age of policing where powerful men operated in the shadows without oversight, their crimes buried beneath the glitz and glamour of a modernizing metropolis. The ultimate horror of the Sydney 2001 cold case was no longer contained within the physical act of the murder itself, nor was it limited to the 25 years of BTAC that had tortured a grieving family. The true, enduring shockwave was the realization that the system of justice was entirely symbiotic with the system of crime, that the boundaries between the protector and the predator were entirely fluid, defined not by moral certainty or the rule of law, but by who held the power to write the official report and control the focus of the lens. The case had been solved, the handcuffs had been slapped on, and the sentence had been delivered with the full weight of modern science. Yet the city could not shake the terrifying, claustrophobic sensation that the darkness had not been defeated. It had merely been archived, cataloged, and filed away in a box, waiting for the next master of the craft to discover how to use the light to hide the blood. The deciphering of the leather-bound ledger found in Marcus Thorne's wine cellar did not take place in an ordinary laboratory, but inside a subterranean, high-security facility beneath the New South Wales Parliament House, where the air was cold and the doors were guarded by federal operatives. As the military codebreakers systematically dismantled the complex numeric ciphers over several weeks, they did not find a list of traditional assets, but rather a blueprint for a parallel shadow network that had dictated the outcomes of Sydney's most high-profile criminal trials for nearly 3 decades. The ledger contained precise coordinates to 3 off-site, climate-controlled storage lockers located in industrial zones across the outer western suburbs, vaults of illicit information that Thorne had maintained as his personal insurance policy against the very department he had commanded. When Detective Inspector Elena Vance led a specialized, silent tactical unit to breach the first of these hidden lockers in Blacktown, the reality of Thorne's psychological empire was laid bare in a terrifying display of clinical blackmail. Inside the storage unit, beneath rows of heavy industrial plastic sheeting, sat 15 fireproof filing cabinets containing hundreds of pristine, unedited audio cassette tapes, VHS recordings, and original forensic specimens that had vanished from official police evidence rooms between 1995 and 2018. These were not random trophies. They were the absolute proofs of malfeasance committed by the city's elite. Politicians, Supreme Court judges, senior corporate executives, and high-ranking police officials who had crawled to Thorne over the decades to make their personal indiscretions, their financial crimes, and their vehicular manslaughters disappear. Thorne had never destroyed the evidence of their sins. He had preserved it with the exact same meticulous care he had used to mask the murder of Clara Vance, transforming their vulnerabilities into a permanent, unyielding foundation for his own absolute immunity within the justice system. The discoveries send a wave of absolute, cold panic through the upper echelons of the state government, triggering an immediate, behind-the-closed-doors constitutional crisis that threatened to completely dissolve the sitting parliament. Elena Vance found herself standing at the center of a historical storm, facing immense, quiet pressure from the highest offices in the land to bury the contents of the storage lockers under the guise of national security and the preservation of public order. Powerful men who had survived decades of political shifts suddenly realized that their entire lives, their careers, and their legacies were contained within a cardboard box held by a young, unyielding detective inspector who could not be bought, intimidated, or negotiated with. But Elena understood that to compromise now would be to become another cog in the very machine that Marcus Thorne had built on the blood of Clara Vance, and she chose instead to bypass the traditional chains of command, delivering duplicates of the decrypted files directly to an independent federal anti-corruption tribunal. While the political foundations of the city began to fracture under the weight of these impending exposures, the atmosphere inside the Long Bay Correctional Complex, where Thorne had been temporarily transferred for a mandatory medical evaluation, turned increasingly volatile. The prison hierarchy had been completely upended by his arrival. He was a walking detonation device, a man who possessed the power to destroy the careers of the very judges who signed the warrants and the politicians who funded the cells. Despite being held in an isolated, multi-million-dollar maximum security medical wing monitored 24 hours a day by a dedicated team of elite correctional officers, Thorne's influence seemed to bleed through the concrete walls like a toxic mist. He did not behave like an inmate facing a lifetime of sensory deprivation. He carried himself with the supreme, maddening confidence of a man who knew that his ultimate masterpiece was still functioning exactly as intended, even from within the dark. Prison records from July 2026 reveal that Thorne spent his limited exercise hours pacing the high-walled yard with a precise, measured stride, his eyes constantly analyzing the security perimeters, the blind spots of the cameras, and the behavioral patterns of the guards assigned to his rotation. He had begun using his deep, psychological understanding of institutional vulnerability to slowly, systematically subvert the discipline of the younger correctional staff, exploiting their personal financial stresses, their professional frustrations, and their natural awe of his legendary status to establish a subtle web of compliance within his unit. He didn't offer bribes. He offered information, whispered tips about local criminal enterprises, warnings about impending prison structural shifts, and strategic advice on how to navigate the internal politics of the department, slowly turning his keepers into his couriers. The danger of his continued presence in the metropolitan prison system became terrifyingly clear when an anonymous, heavily encrypted digital file was uploaded to an international whistleblowing platform containing 3 hours of raw, unedited security footage from inside the Homicide Squad's internal briefing rooms during the original 2001 investigation. The leak did not merely expose the technical incompetence of Task Force Delta, it showed Marcus Thorne in high-definition clarity, standing before a whiteboard, deliberately and masterfully gaslighting his junior detectives, steering them away from a highly credible eyewitness report that placed his private vehicle at the scene of Clara Vance's murder. The public reaction to this video was an explosion of collective fury. It was no longer a theoretical courtroom argument about DNA molecules. It was a visceral, undeniable view of a monster actively manipulating the machinery of justice in real time, laughing at the naivety of the public he had sworn to protect. The city's alternative media and true crime networks feasted on the footage, breaking it down frame by frame, analyzing every micro-expression on Thorne's face, every cynical gesture of his hands, turning the 25-year-old deception into a live, interactive digital spectacle that completely dominated the cultural conversation. Protest groups formed outside the New South Wales Police Headquarters on College Street, demanding the immediate resignation of the entire executive command, the dissolution of the homicide unit, and a complete, independent restructuring of the state's forensic science laboratories. The collective paranoia reached an all-time high as ordinary citizens began to realize that the official historical record of the city's crimes was a fiction, a narrative written by a sociopathic author who had used the real lives and deaths of innocent people as raw material for his own professional advancement. Inside her office, Elena Vance sat surrounded by the ghosts of Thorne's past, her eyes bloodshot from a lack of sleep as she focused her attention on the second hidden storage locker, located in a derelict shipyard along the Parramatta River. This vault proved to be even more sinister than the first. It did not contain files or tapes, but rather a chilling collection of physical items, clothing, jewelry, driver's licenses, and lockets of hair, belonging to over 30 young women who had gone missing along the eastern seaboard of Australia between 1992 and 2015. Each item was carefully preserved in an airtight glass jar, meticulously labeled with a date, a time, and a specific geographic coordinate that did not correspond to any known police recovery zone. The realization hit the task force like a sudden, freezing wave. Marcus Thorne was not just a corrupt cop who had committed a single murder to protect his reputation. He was one of the most prolific, disciplined serial predators in the history of the continent, a man who had used his position as the head of the Homicide Squad to actively conceal his own multi-decade hunting campaign. The logistics of his survival became immediately apparent. Whenever a young woman disappeared within his jurisdiction, Thorne would immediately volunteer to take charge of the initial missing persons file, utilizing his absolute authority to classify the victims as runaways, voluntary departures, or suicides before a formal criminal investigation could even be launched. He would personally visit their residences, ostensibly to comfort the families and gather personal items for tracking, but in reality, he was harvesting his trophies and erasing any potential forensic links that could connect the disappearances to his own movements. He had turned the entire geographic expanse of New South Wales into his private, protected hunting ground, using the sirens of his police cruiser to clear the streets and his gold shield to bypass any security camera or patrol officer that dared to cross his path during his midnight operations. Elena Vance knew that she could no longer treat this as a standard historical investigation. She was dealing with an ongoing, massive humanitarian disaster, a labyrinth of grief that extended into hundreds of families across the country who had spent decades wondering why their daughters had vanished without a trace. She ordered the immediate formation of a top-secret forensic task force, codenamed Operation Nemesis, comprising international skeletal identification experts, geneticists, and profiling specialists who were flown into Sydney under assumed names to begin the monumental task of matching the trophies in the glass jars to the National Missing Persons Database. The work was slow, grueling, and emotionally devastating. Every match represented a cold case reopened, a family forced to confront the terrifying reality that the man who had signed the death certificates and looked them in the eye during their moments of deepest grief was the very monster who had buried their children in the bush. As the first 10 identities were confirmed, young students, travelers, and professional women whose lives had been abruptly extinguished during Thorne's peak operational years, the legal pressure on the fallen detective sergeant intensified to an unprecedented degree. The Federal Department of Public Prosecutions prepared a massive, secondary indictment charging Thorne with 10 counts of historical murder, a legal move designed to ensure that even if his original conviction for Clara Vance was somehow overturned on a technical appeal, he would still die behind the walls of a maximum security prison. But Thorne remained entirely unfazed by the mounting charges, his legal team maintaining an aggressive, stonewall defense that refused to engage with the forensic evidence, instead demanding a full, public trial where Thorne intended to use his cross-examination rights to systematically expose the contents of his blackmail ledger on the public record. The psychological warfare between Thorne and the state had reached a terrifying impasse. He was holding a knife to the throat of the institution, threatening to pull down the entire legal, political, and social infrastructure of New South Wales if they did not grant him a transfer to a low-security coastal facility and a permanent cessation of the Operation Nemesis investigations. He knew that the government was terrified of what would happen if the names in his ledger were read out in open court, that it would trigger a wave of institutional collapses that could take decades to recover from. He sat in his medical cell, a master chess player who had lost his pieces but still held the board hostage, watching the panic of his adversaries with a cold, detached satisfaction that proved his sociopathic vanity was entirely untouched by his fall from grace. But Elena Vance refused to play his game. She understood that the only way to truly defeat a monster who lived by the manipulation of information was to make the truth absolute, public, and entirely non-negotiable. On a Thursday afternoon that would permanently change the history of investigative journalism in Australia, she walked into a packed press conference at the Federal Courts building, carrying a single encrypted hard drive containing the complete, unredacted contents of Marcus Thorne's blackmail ledger and the forensic findings of Operation Nemesis. Ignoring the frantic, whispered warnings of the state government representatives standing at the back of the room, she plugged the drive into the central media server, broadcasting the raw data simultaneously to every major news outlet, legal archive, and public database across the globe. The era of secrets is over, Elena stated, her voice echoing through the stunned, silent room with an unyielding, crystalline clarity that signaled the end of Thorne's empire. For 25 years, one man used the power of the badge, the corruption of the state, and the silence of powerful men to hide a legacy of unparalleled horror. We will not negotiate with the predator. We will not protect the names of those who allowed him to hunt our children. Let the world see what lay hidden in the dark. The drop of the data hit the global network like a digital tsunami, causing servers to crash, phones to ring across every government department, and the absolute collapse of several prominent public careers within minutes of the broadcast. The shield that Marcus Thorne had spent a lifetime constructing had been permanently shattered, not by a legal compromise, but by the absolute, uncompromising light of total exposure, leaving him naked, powerless, and alone in his concrete cell, stripped of his last weapon as the true scale of his atrocity was finally laid bare before the world he had tried so hard to master. The digital detonation of Marcus Thorne's blackmail ledger did more than dismantle his leverage. It plunged the entire metropolitan area into an unprecedented state of institutional anarchy. As the unredacted files spread through the global network, the names of prominent figures, Supreme Court justices, state members of parliament, police commissioners, and corporate titans, were exposed alongside the explicit proofs of their historical transgressions. By the evening of that fateful Thursday, The streets surrounding the New South Wales Parliament House were choked with thousands of citizens, their faces illuminated by the glow of mobile screens as they read the raw, chilling evidence of a 25-year conspiracy. The state government disintegrated within 48 hours, paralyzed by a wave of high-profile resignations, emergency sackings, and the immediate federal detentions of several individuals who had once held the highest offices in the land. The very machinery that had protected Thorne for a quarter of a century had been violently torn out by its roots, leaving the fallen detective sergeant isolated in a vacuum of his own making. Inside the Long Bay Correctional Complex, the structural shift was instantaneous and absolute. The network of compliance that Thorne had masterfully cultivated among the younger correctional staff vanished overnight. The guards who had once looked at him with a degree of professional awe now viewed him as a toxic containment hazard, a walking contamination that could destroy their careers and land them in neighboring cells. He was stripped of his minor privileges. His exercise hours were reduced to a single, unmovable 30-minute window at midnight, and his communication with the outside world was permanently severed by a federal national security order. Yet, when the elite tactical extraction team entered his cell at 3 a.m. to transfer him back to the absolute isolation of Goulburn Supermax, they did not find a defeated old man. Thorne stood waiting for them in the center of the room, his uniform perfectly crisp, his hands already held out for the heavy transport irons, his face an unreadable mask of cold, intellectual curiosity. The transport operation was conducted under conditions of maximum battlefield security, utilizing a convoy of armored vehicles, air support from the police aviation branch, and a complete communications blackout along the Southern Highway to prevent any potential ambush or escape attempt by remaining elements of his shattered shadow network. As the convoy hurtled through the black, rain-swept landscape of the Southern Highlands, Thorne sat in the rear compartment of the lead armored vehicle, the heavy steel shackles rattling against the floor with every twist of the road. He looked out through the narrow, reinforced ballistic glass slit at the dark forest lining the highway, his mind working with that same predatory precision that had allowed him to control the narrative of Clara Vance's murder for 2.5 decades. He understood that while his political shield was gone, his true monument, the physical evidence of his multi-decade hunting campaign, was still being unearthed by Operation Nemesis, and that every skeleton pulled from the earth was another testament to his absolute supremacy over the system. Back in Sydney, Detective Inspector Elena Vance had converted the unresolved homicide squad floor into a command center for a multi-jurisdictional disaster victim identification operation. The second storage locker along the Parramatta River had yielded over 30 glass jars containing the physical trophies of missing women, and the laboratory was now working in continuous shifts to extract DNA profiles from the clothing fragments, jewelry, and locks of hair preserved within the glass. The air in the facility was thick with the scent of sterile chemicals and the underlying heavy weight of historic grief as families from across the nation descended upon the police headquarters, their faces etched with the agonizing hope that their decades of torment might finally be approaching a terrible, definitive conclusion. Elena stood before a massive, wall-mounted map of the Australian continent, her eyes tracking the cluster of red pins that marked the locations where each missing woman had last been seen, a geographic trail that aligned flawlessly with Thorne's official travel records, conference attendances, and regional investigative assignments dating back to 1992. The analytical data revealed a terrifying methodology that the profiling experts had never encountered before. Thorne did not possess a single, static hunting ground. He utilized his official duties as a mobile laboratory, converting his police-issued four-wheel-drive vehicles into self-contained tactical operational bases. When assigned to investigate a regional homicide or lead a task force in the state's far west, he would utilize his unrestricted movement to scout isolated access tracks, deep forestry reserves, and abandoned mining shafts during his off-shift hours. He understood the structural limitations of regional policing better than any man alive. He knew which small-town stations lacked night patrols, which local emergency frequencies were unmonitored after midnight, and how long it would take for a missing person report to bleed through the regional bureaucracy to the Central Intelligence Database in Sydney. He was a predator who hunted with the full mapping capability of the state at his fingertips, using the very grid designed to track crime to ensure his own atrocities remained completely invisible. The breakthrough for the secondary murder charges arrived when the forensic team analyzed a specific item recovered from jar number 14, a small, tarnished silver locket containing a faded photograph of an elderly couple. The item was matched within minutes to the file of 19-year-old university student Melissa Hayes, who had vanished from a bus stop in the coastal town of Wollongong in September 2004, a case that Thorne had personally reviewed and classified as a voluntary disappearance due to a manufactured diary entry he had conveniently discovered during a search of her student residence. Armed with the precise geographic coordinates scrawled inside Thorne's leather ledger alongside the entry for Jar 14, a specialized forensic archaeological team, equipped with deep penetrating ground radar and skeletal recovery K9 units, was dispatched to an isolated state forest precinct 50 kilometers west of the coast. The search was grueling, conducted in the teeth of a bitter winter wind that howled through the dense eucalyptus trees, the ground hard and choked with thick, ancient root systems that resisted the shovels. For 3 days, the radar units scanned the earth, tracking anomalies in the soil density until the third morning, when a specialized canine unit alerted frantically at the base of a massive, hollowed-out ironbark tree. Working with meticulous, millimeter-by-millimeter precision, the anthropologists cleared away centuries of leaf litter and topsoil, eventually exposing a shallow, hand-dug grave containing the skeletal remains of a young female, her posture identical to the clinical, serene arrangement Thorne had utilized at the scene of Clara Vance's murder in 2001. The physical signature was undeniable. It was a manifestation of absolute, controlled power, a message carved into the earth that screamed of an perpetrator who viewed his victims not as human beings, but as permanent monuments to his ability to deceive. As the news of the physical recovery broke across the national airwaves, the psychological atmosphere inside the Goulburn Supermax reached an explosive critical mass. The Federal Department of Public Prosecutions formally served Thorne with the first 10 warrants for historical murder, delivered to him through the heavy security slot of his cell door by a federal marshal who refused to look him in the eye. Thorne took the paperwork, sat down at his small concrete desk, and began reading through the hundreds of pages of forensic evidence with the detached, analytical focus of a senior investigator reviewing a subordinate's brief. He did not call for his lawyers. He did not request a medical exemption. He merely utilized his blue plastic pen to make neat, systematic annotations in the margins of the Crown's case, looking for the minute procedural flaws that had been his stock in trade for his entire adult life. The public trial for the Operation Nemesis victims was scheduled to take place in the High Court of Australia, an unprecedented legal arrangement designed to insulate the proceedings from the systemic corruption that had shattered the state-level courts of New South Wales. The city of Sydney found itself trapped in a perpetual state of legal reckoning, the cultural landscape permanently altered by the realization that their history had been curated by a monster. True crime media, once characterized by a degree of sensationalist entertainment, shifted into a somber, analytical mode, producing long-form documentaries that functioned as public autopsies of the Thorne era. The central question that dominated the intellectual discourse was no longer how Thorne had committed the crimes, but how the collective psychology of an entire society could be so profoundly blinded by the myth of authority, the uniform, and the gold shield. The true climax of this historical detoxification occurred when Elena Vance received an anonymous package at her private residence, a package that had bypassed the police mailroom security through an untraceable domestic courier network. Inside the cardboard box was an old, dust-covered microcassette tape labeled with a single date, November 13th, 2001, the exact night Clara Vance was murdered in her Camperdown apartment. Elena brought the tape into the secure audio restoration lab at the headquarters, her hands trembling slightly as the technician adjusted the filters, clearing away the heavy hiss of magnetic degradation to reveal the voices captured within the tape. The recording did not take place inside Unit 312. It was a capture of the internal police radio frequency during the critical 90-minute window before the first official patrol vehicle was dispatched to the scene. The voice that boomed through the speakers was unmistakably that of Marcus Thorne, his tone calm, steady, and entirely authoritative as he checked in with the Central Dispatch controller, claiming he was currently engaged in an active, high-priority surveillance operation in the eastern suburbs and was unavailable for any local incidents. Yet, in the background of his transmission, beneath the steady hum of his vehicle's engine, the distinct, rhythmic sound of the Camperdown apartment complex's automatic parking gate alarm could be heard chiming, a mechanical warning that triggered whenever a vehicle remained within the secure entry lane for more than 60 seconds without a valid keycard. The tape was the ultimate proof of premeditation, an audio record of a killer actively constructing his digital alibi while sitting in the dark outside his victim's door, utilizing his knowledge of the dispatch cycles to ensure that no other unit would disrupt his timeline. He had stayed in that parking lane, watching the rain hit his windshield, waiting for the precise moment when the local sector cars were occupied with a domestic disturbance 3 kilometers away before using his master emergency keycard to ascend to the 3rd floor. The revelation that the entire response system had been manipulated in real time by the perpetrator himself provided the final, devastating piece of structural scaffolding that Elena needed to permanently close the historical file. When she returned to Goulburn to confront Thorne with the audio recording, she did not sit behind the glass of the visitor's room. She entered the secure management unit cell accompanied by 2 heavily armed tactical officers, placing the small digital recorder on the concrete table between them. She pressed play, allowing the sound of the mechanical gate alarm and Thorne's own 25-year-old voice to echo through the sterile, white-walled room, watching his face with an unyielding, crystalline focus to catch the first crack in his sociopathic armor. Thorne sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the revolving digital timer of the recorder, his expression shifting slowly from detached amusement to a cold, razor-sharp intensity that filled the small space with an almost physical tension. When the recording ended, he did not offer a clever legal defense, nor did he repeat his patronizing lectures about the necessity of institutional order. He leaned back against the concrete wall, his long, scarred hands gripping the edge of the table as he looked directly into Elena Vance's eyes, his voice dropping into that low, guttural register that had terrified a generation of suspects in the interrogation rooms of the city. "You think you've buried me, Elena," he whispered, a faint, wintry smile touching his lips. "But you've only proven my point. I operated within the architecture you all built. I used your radios, your codes, your gates, and your blind faith to create a space of absolute freedom. You can lock this body in a box until it rots, but every time a woman walks down a dark street in this city and looks behind her, she isn't looking for a stranger. She's looking for me. I am the shadow that the uniform throws." The chilling arrogance of his final statement was not a declaration of victory, but a terrifying, accurate diagnosis of the permanent psychological scar he had inflicted on the society he had preyed upon. Elena did not respond. She reached out, turned off the recorder, and walked out of the cell without a word, leaving Marcus Thorne alone in the clinical, unyielding light of the maximum security precinct, his name permanently stripped of its honor, his legacy reduced to an index of human depravity. The trial that followed in the High Court would be a formality, an administrative cataloging of horrors that would result in a historical sentence of perpetual natural life, without the possibility of release, ensuring that the wolf would remain caged until his final breath. Yet, as the rain continued to fall over the harbor, washing the modern streets of Sydney under the watchful eye of thousands of new digital surveillance networks, the city remained locked in the quiet, claustrophobic knowledge that the greatest evil did not come from the darkness outside, it was the one that held the light. The High Court of Australia's special session convened under a state of total security that transformed the federal courtroom into a digital fortress, insulated from the external chaos that continued to fracture the state-level institutions of New South Wales. The atmosphere inside the room was characterized by a heavy, clinical gravity, a stark contrast to the sensationalist media circus that had defined the earlier proceedings in the lower courts. For the 10 families whose daughters had been pulled from the earth by the archaeologists of Operation Nemesis, this trial was not a search for an unknown perpetrator, but a systematic, public autopsy of a system that had allowed a serial killer to carry a gun, wear a badge, and control the searchlight for over 3 decades. Marcus Thorne sat in the newly reinforced central glass enclosure, his appearance remarkably unchanged despite months of maximum security isolation. He maintained his rigid, military posture, his eyes remaining fixed on the projection screens with the cold, intellectual detachment of a general reviewing historical battlefields. The Crown's prosecution strategy for this secondary trial bypassed all emotional rhetoric, focusing exclusively on the spatial and temporal intersection of Thorne's official movements with the exact forensic profiles of the 10 recovered victims. The lead federal prosecutor, a sharp, unyielding jurist named Alastair Vance, working in tandem with Elena Vance's analytical unit, introduced a massive, high-dimensional digital matrix that cross-referenced 30 years of police vehicle telemetry, expense receipts, regional radio logs, and toll data with the decomposition timelines established by the forensic anthropologists. The screen flickered to life, displaying a highly detailed geographic map of the state, slowly overlaying Thorne's verified locations with the precise points where the missing women had last been seen, revealing a mathematical synchronization so precise it eliminated any possibility of coincidence. The prosecution called to the stand the chief forensic pathologist who had led the examinations of the remains recovered from the regional state forests. She detailed the highly specific, structural methodology of the skeletal trauma, demonstrating to the court that each victim had been subjected to a highly controlled clinical immobilization technique, a modern iteration of compliance holds taught exclusively at the New South Wales Police Academy during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The killer had not used crude violence. He had utilized institutional training to neutralize his targets, leaving no defensive fractures, no signs of frantic resistance, and no macro-level trauma that would alert a local medical examiner if a body were discovered prematurely. The physical signature was identical across all 10 cases, extending from the 1994 disappearance of Melissa Hayes to the 2012 murder of a young traveler near the Hunter Valley, a systematic execution of power that proved Thorne had been operating a parallel, hidden career of slaughter throughout his entire tenure as a homicide commander. The defense team, heavily restricted by the total exposure of the blackmail ledger and the absolute clarity of the modern touch DNA profiles, attempted to launch a complex jurisdictional challenge, arguing that the federal court lacked the constitutional authority to try historical state offenses under a unified indictment. Arthur Pendleton stood before the High Court bench, his voice strained, stripped of the theatrical arrogance he had displayed during the Clara Vance trial, now desperately trying to exploit technical ambiguities in the colonial-era legal frameworks to force a mistrial or a permanent stay of proceedings. He argued that the introduction of the digital ledger had contaminated the jury pool to such an extent that a fair trial was structurally impossible within the Commonwealth, demanding that the charges be severed and returned to individual regional jurisdictions where the bodies had been recovered. The High Court justices did not hesitate, rejecting the defense's technical maneuvers with a series of sharp, definitive rulings that signaled the absolute end of the legal immunity Thorne had manipulated for so long. The Chief Justice leaned forward, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom with an unyielding, crystalline authority. The architecture of justice will not be utilized as a shield for institutional atrocity. The Commonwealth possesses both the right and the moral obligation to try these crimes under a singular framework of objective science. This ruling cleared the path for the prosecution to introduce the most devastating piece of direct evidence recovered from the third and final storage locker, an item that had been held in reserve until the physical timelines had been firmly established before the jury. Alastair Vance directed the court officers to present an exhibit labeled Exhibit 44B. A heavy, commercial-grade digital video camera recovered from a false bottom in one of Thorne's field lockers, containing an archived series of high-capacity data cards that had never been modified or accessed since the mid-2000s. The prosecution did not play the video files in open court, choosing instead to present a series of verified, frame-by-frame analytical readouts and audio frequency charts that had been processed by federal intelligence technicians. The metadata on the cards revealed that Thorne had used the camera's internal clock to log the exact times of his operations, linking the recordings directly to the hours when his official police radio had been manually logged offline for vehicle maintenance or remote surveillance duties. The emotional weight inside the room reached a suffocating peak as the prosecution demonstrated that Thorne had utilized his police-issued laptop to log into the central missing persons database while sitting in his vehicle alongside the active scenes of his crimes, checking to see if local commands had initiated searches before he had even left the perimeter. He had watched the system react in real time to his own violence, using the internal alerts to adjust his disposal methods and ensure that regional investigators were looking in the entirely wrong directions. The revelation depicted a level of sociopathic calculation that surpassed the traditional definitions of a serial predator. Thorne had treated the entire law enforcement apparatus of the state as a giant, interactive mirror that reflected his own absolute control over life and death. As the trial reached its final stages, the defense made a last, desperate attempt to mitigate the inevitable verdict by introducing a series of sealed psychiatric reports claiming that Thorne was suffering from advanced cognitive decline and structural neurological degeneration, arguing he was no longer mentally competent to understand the judgment of the court. This tactic was instantly shattered when Marcus Thorne himself stood up within the glass dock, interrupting his own counsel with a sharp, commanding gesture that instantly silenced the courtroom. He looked directly at the bench of high court justices, his expression one of absolute, unwavering lucidity, his voice returning to that deep, authoritative register that had once dominated the internal briefings of Task Force Delta. "I am entirely competent, Your Honors," Thorne said, his tone steady, cold, and devoid of any fear or remorse. "I do not require the protection of medical fabrications. The work I conducted over 30 years was not a product of madness. It was a product of design. I understood the system because I helped build it, and I knew exactly how much weight it could bear before it collapsed. You may pass your sentences, you may write your histories, but you cannot undo the reality that for 3 decades, the law in this state was exactly what I said it was." The statement was a definitive, chilling confirmation of his total awareness, a final act of hubris that stripped away any remaining pretense of a legal defense and left the jury with no alternative but to deliver a swift, unyielding condemnation. The jury returned after less than an hour of formal deliberation, the foreperson delivering 10 consecutive verdicts of guilty, with a clinical precision that felt like the rhythmic slamming of 10 separate steel doors. The judge did not delay the final reckoning, sentencing Marcus Thorne to 10 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the absolute possibility of parole, ordering that he be returned to the maximum security segregation unit at Goulburn to serve his sentences in total administrative isolation from the human race. The double trial process was officially concluded, the legal files closed, and the name of Marcus Thorne permanently erased from the rolls of honor, leaving behind a broken department and a city that would spend generations trying to rebuild the foundations of its trust. The true legacy of the Sydney 2001 cold case was not found in the finality of the court's judgment, but in the permanent transformation of the cultural landscape that followed the exposure of the wolf within the fold. The apartment complex in Camperdown where Clara Vance had lost her life remained standing against the gray winter sky, a silent, concrete witness to the night the uniform became a shroud, while her family finally stepped out of the shadow of the unknown into a cold, hard space of absolute certainty. The rain continued to fall over the harbor, washing the concrete clean, but the memory of the deception remained locked in the stone, a perpetual, haunting reminder that the ultimate monster is not the one who hides in the shadows, but the one who wears the light to blind the world to the blood on his hands. The institutional devastation unleashed by the High Court's final verdicts did not diminish with Marcus Thorne's permanent removal to Goulburn Supermax. Instead, it marked the beginning of a cold, forensic winter for the city of Sydney. With the mastermind officially stripped of his rank, his pension, and his freedom, the federal oversight bodies realized that the physical infrastructure of Thorne's empire, the actual mechanics he used to maintain his absolute secrecy, had to be dismantled piece by piece to ensure no dormant element of his network could ever reemerge. Detective Inspector Elena Vance was appointed to lead a specialized, highly secretive liquidation unit known as Task Force Echo, tasked with a singular, grueling objective, tracking down every single asset, safe house, encrypted bank account, and physical repository that Thorne had established across the continent over a 30-year period. The investigation shifted from the active theater of the courtroom into the quiet, suffocating atmosphere of commercial real estate registries, maritime logs, and deep soil scans of remote properties that had remained in Thorne's private possession under a web of corporate aliases. The first breakthrough of this final phase occurred not in the dense forests of the regional interior, but within the industrialized labyrinth of the Port Kembla shipping terminal, 80 kilometers south of the metropolitan area. Task Force Echo analysts, working through decades of digitized maritime freight manifests, identified a high-security industrial storage bay that had been continuously leased by a shelf company registered in the British Virgin Islands, a company whose ultimate beneficial owner was linked directly to the primary decryption keys recovered from Thorne's wine cellar ledger. When Elena and her team breached the facility on a bitter, windswept morning, they did not find standard contraband, but a meticulously maintained automotive workshop containing 3 vintage, fleet-spec police sedans from the late 1990s and early 2000s, preserved under airtight synthetic wraps like historical exhibits in a museum of death. These vehicles were the missing links that the initial 2001 investigation had failed to account for: unmarked, unmonitored transport platforms that Thorne had systematically extracted from the police asset disposal pool by falsifying maintenance destruction certificates. He had kept them completely off the grid, stored in a secure maritime zone where he could service them away from the eyes of department mechanics, utilizing them as specialized operational vehicles for his midnight excursions along the coast. The forensic team immediately subjected the interiors of the sedans to a comprehensive, multispectral chemical scan, stripping away the leather seating and the door panels to reveal the microscopic forensic footprints of passengers who had vanished from the streets of Sydney decades prior. Trapped within the air filtration systems and beneath the industrial carpeting were individual strands of hair, fiber fragments from university backpacks, and microscopic traces of dried biological fluids that matched 3 of the remaining unidentified profiles from the Operation Nemesis database. The discovery proved that Thorne's operational sophistication was entirely industrial. He had not merely used his badge to bypass suspicion. He had constructed an independent, self-sustaining logistical network that mirrored the capabilities of a specialized state intelligence agency. He understood that a vehicle was a rolling repository of evidence, and by maintaining his own private fleet of decommissioned police cruisers, he could ensure that no modern automated license plate recognition system or GPS tracking grid could ever link his official duties to the precise coordinates of his hunting grounds. He had driven these phantoms through the dark, wet streets of the city, secure in the knowledge that even if a patrol officer spotted the vehicle parked near an isolated access track, the classic, authoritative silhouette of a detective's sedan would instantly disarm any professional curiosity. While Elena's team was cataloging the horrors of Port Kembla, a profound, lingering crisis was paralyzing the state's current homicide squad, which found itself completely unable to function under the weight of the public's unyielding skepticism. Every active investigation was now viewed through the distorting lens of the Thorne scandal. Defense lawyers routinely demanded the full disclosure of all internal communications, vehicle logs, and private financial records of every detective assigned to their clients' cases, creating a state of administrative paralysis that ground the justice system to a virtual halt. The collective confidence had been so thoroughly shattered that the mere presence of a police uniform at a crime scene was no longer viewed as a symbol of restoration, but as a potential act of scene contamination, a systemic trauma that forced the police commissioner to issue an unprecedented public apology and announce the complete, mandatory retirement of any senior officer who had served alongside Thorne during his peak operational years. The psychological atmosphere inside Goulburn Supermax, meanwhile, had settled into an eerie, mechanical routine that the prison administration watched with constant vigilance. Thorne was held under a special, extreme high-risk security classification, confined to a self-contained concrete pod where his only human contact occurred through the reinforced glass of his cell window or the heavy, automated steel slot where his meals were delivered. He spent his days in total silence, refusing to utilize his allocated reading privileges or watch the educational programming permitted to long-term inmates, choosing instead to pace the exact dimensions of his room with a rhythmic, unvarying stride that matched the ticking of the security clock on the corridor wall. The prison psychologists noted in their weekly reports that Thorne exhibited no signs of institutional depression or situational anxiety. He carried himself with the cold, immovable vanity of a monument, a man who viewed his confinement not as a defeat, but as the final, necessary retirement of a master craftsman whose work was entirely complete. The final confirmation of his absolute detachment arrived on a gray afternoon in November 2026, precisely 25 years to the day since Clara Vance had been found dead inside her secure Camperdown apartment. Elena Vance traveled down the Southern Highway to the Supermax facility one final time, carrying a leather binder containing the absolute completion reports of Task Force Echo, the final, definitive inventory of his asset liquidations, the identification of all 32 victims from the storage jars, and the formal decommissioning of his shadow network. She sat behind the heavy ballistic glass of the maximum security interview room, waiting in the absolute stillness as the automated heavy iron doors slid open, allowing Thorne to step forward into the visitor's enclosure, his wrists and ankles secured by heavy transport irons that clanked loudly against the polished concrete floor. He sat down slowly, his face etched with the deep lines of a man who had not seen the natural sun in months, yet his eyes remained as bright, piercing, and intensely vacant of humanity as they had been the morning he stood over Clara's body in 2001. He looked at the leather binder resting on the steel table between them, a faint, mocking smile touching his thin lips as he adjusted his state-issued green uniform. "You've come to show me the ledger, Elena," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the intercom system. "You've come to tell me that you've crossed out all the names, found all the cars, and cleared all the files from your system." "The work is done, Marcus," Elena stated, her voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of any emotional triumph. "Every victim has been identified. Every property has been seized by the state. Your shadow network has been entirely erased from the archives of this country. There is nothing left of your name except an index number in a maximum security prison file. You are completely anonymous now." Thorne let out a low, dry chuckle that turned into a brief, wheezing cough, leaning forward until his face was only inches from the glass, his intense gaze locking onto hers with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "You think you can erase a reality with a filing cabinet, child?" he whispered, his eyes unblinking. "You haven't destroyed my work. You've merely archived it. Every procedure your detectives use today, every forensic protocol you used to track me down, every piece of technology you brought into that courtroom, it was all shaped, refined, and driven by the choices I made over 30 years. I didn't just commit crimes, Elena. I dictated the evolution of your entire justice system. You spent 25 years looking for me, and in doing so, you became exactly the kind of hunter I wanted you to be. You are my true monument." The statement was the ultimate manifestation of his sociopathic hubris, a final, unyielding refusal to accept the moral weight of his destruction, choosing instead to view the entire mechanism of his exposure as a validation of his supreme intelligence. Elena did not argue with him. She did not offer the emotional satisfaction of anger or defensive justification. She slowly closed the leather binder, stood up from the steel chair, and signaled the tactical guards to terminate the interview, looking down at the fallen Titan one last time with an expression of pure, clinical indifference. "The difference, Marcus," she said quietly before turning her back on him, "is that the light belongs to us now. You stay in the dark." As the heavy steel security doors slid shut behind her, locking Marcus Thorne into the absolute, perpetual silence of his concrete tomb, Elena walked out into the crisp, clear afternoon air of the Southern Highlands, the sky opening up to reveal a pale, neutral blue that seemed to signal the true end of the long nightmare. Back in Sydney, the city was moving forward, the headlines shifting to new economic cycles, infrastructural projects, and the ordinary, chaotic rhythm of a modern metropolis that was finally free from the shadow of the unknown. The apartment building in Camperdown stood quiet under the afternoon sun, its windows clear, its entry locks modernized, a place where people lived their lives without looking over their shoulders, completely unaware that the safety they enjoyed had been bought at the price of a 25-year war against the wolf who wore the badge. The file was officially closed, the truth was absolute, and the memory of Clara Vance was finally permitted to fade into the quiet, peaceful history of a city that would never forget the lesson of her protector.